Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Hillel Neuer. I'm the Executive Director of United Nations Watch. We're marking our 31st year since we were founded here in Geneva to monitor the United Nations and hold it accountable to the principles of its own charter. I'd like to welcome all of you and people watching around the world online to the first ever International Summit for a Future Beyond UNRWA. We're at a turning point. Just a few weeks ago, most of the donor states of UNRWA, led by the United States, froze their funding for the first time to this agency over evidence that members of the UNRWA staff actually took part in the atrocities of October 7th. Evidence, as reported in the Wall Street Journal, that anywhere between 1,200 to 1,500 employees of UNRWA, a so-called humanitarian group, actually belong to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And actually with us here, we'll hear from her later, is Ayelet Samerano. She is the mother of 21-year-old Jonathan, who tragically was murdered on 7th October, and his lifeless body is seen on a video, and we'll see it later when Ayelet speaks, was taken away by an UNRWA social worker. It's seen on video, driving a white SUV with UNRWA license plates. That just underscores so much of what we'll hear today, the problem with this supposedly humanitarian organization. So countries have frozen funding. That's where we're at today. They created 2 inquiries. One is by the Internal Oversight Office, known as OIOS. We'll hear shortly from Ed Flaherty. He's a lawyer here in Geneva, and he's an expert on UN investigations. And we're going to understand how this OIOS is indeed perhaps the last kind of entity that can conduct an independent investigation. It's not independent. We'll hear from him about that. And there's a second investigation, which is very significant. It's headed by Catherine Colonna, the former French foreign minister. She just stepped down about a month ago. And she heads this independent review group set up by the Secretary General. It's supposed to look into how UNRWA deals with violations of neutrality and how they respond to it. And there are serious questions about the independence of this group. Catherine Colonna herself, as she stepped down, she sent a tweet message publicly to the head of UNRWA, congratulating him on his wonderful work, which is needed now more than ever. This was on January 14th, 4 days after we began to reveal the Telegram chat group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers who were celebrating the atrocities of October 7th. So after we exposed it initially on January 10th, 4 days later, this individual, Catherine Colonna, French foreign minister, congratulated UNRWA on their valuable work that is needed now more than ever. Is she really qualified to conduct a credible, objective, serious, independent review? The question answers itself. And the other 3 institutes that are joining with her all have prior pronouncements and statements and reports on their websites which are anything but objective when it comes to UNRWA. So the international community is now waiting. This investigation is due to report back an interim report in a month's time at the end of March. And the spokesman of the Secretary General, Stéphane Dujarric, said that this group is intended to reassure the donor states. In other words, you're all going to have to give back your funding, and we've set up this review group to reassure you. So in a sense, it's all predetermined. We know already in advance that the group headed by Catherine Colonna will reassure the donor states, and they want to reinstate the funding. But we do have this 1 month or 2 months before that happens. And so this is a critical moment. And I want to thank everyone who's come here. We have an incredible group that is assembled here in person. We're going to hear from members of parliament. I'll just note 2 of them. One is Congressman Chris Smith. We'll hear from him in our final panel, which is lawmakers. He's been a leader in the United States Congress in fighting against terrorism and anti-Semitism incited by UNRWA staff. He's the author of legislation to stop funding for UNRWA. It's already passed in the Foreign Affairs Committee quite recently by a large majority. and we're hoping that it will head to a vote in the House itself. I also want to acknowledge David Lega, who's a leader in the European Parliament on these issues, and hopefully I'll get to see him in the European Parliament sometime soon. And obviously also have Assita Kanko here from the European Parliament and Caroline Yadan from the French National Assembly. And did I miss some other members of Parliament who are here in the room? We're going to hear a number of them will be participating by video. Let me just say a word or two about where we are. We are meters away from the United Nations European headquarters, and the Israeli ambassador, who I'll introduce in a moment, just stepped out of the opening ceremony of the United Nations Human Rights Council 2024 session, opened by Mr. Secretary General Guterres. The Human Rights Council was founded in 1946. Its first significant act was to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in December 10th, 1948, at the Palais de Chaillot in Paris. And in that document, in the preamble, it says, this is 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created in response to barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. That is the essence of what the United Nations was supposed to be about, what the Human Rights Council was supposed to be about, and we're just across the street from the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, which is the bastion of humanitarian law. So we are at the center point of universal human rights and humanitarianism in this very spot. And so we ask, are these human rights and humanitarian bodies, are they actually acting against barbarous acts? On October 7th, and we have Ayelet, whose son was tragically murdered as one of these barbarous acts, and her son was, his lifeless body was abducted by an UNRWA worker, and we'll hear from Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz that barbarism and terrorism, sadly, among UNRWA workers is not a bug, but a feature. And I want to ask Mr. Guterres. Mr. Guterres says repeatedly, and he's right next door, and so I ask you, Mr. Guterres, you have said repeatedly that UNRWA is irreplaceable. It is irreplaceable. Well, we're going to hear from humanitarian experts shortly. We're going to hear from Zlatko Zigic, who served at the UN Migration Agency. We're going to hear from Bonnie Glick, who was the Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, from José Garson, an expert at the UN Capital Development Fund, that guess what? UNRWA is not irreplaceable. There are millions of refugees and other individuals who have humanitarian needs who are addressed by an array of UN bodies that are not riddled and infested with terrorism. There are other alternatives. But sadly, Mr. Secretary General, you gave orders, and we know that because it was reported by veteran UN reporter Colin Lynch in DevEx last week, that the Secretary General Guterres has urged the heads of the UN's principal relief agencies, including World Food Programme and UNICEF, to rebuff appeals by Israel and the United States to undertake work currently carried out by the world body's beleaguered Palestinian Refugee Agency. In other words, Secretary General Guterres, notwithstanding efforts by Ambassador David Satterfield, the U.S. humanitarian envoy, and the USAID and the State Department to find other agencies that can do the work. Guterres has given them orders. You're prohibited from picking up any of the services that Palestinians in Gaza need. You're not allowed to do it. So this is what we're facing. And finally, Mr. Guterres, you say repeatedly the talking points that are parroted by the apologists for UNRWA around the world. You say repeatedly that UNRWA does life-saving work. It's a lifeline. We have a video that my colleague Louis prepared. You'll see dozens of individuals around the world parroting the talking points. UNRWA does life-saving work. UNRWA's a lifeline, irreplaceable. Really, Mr. Guterres, 100,000 people in the last 24 hours, more than 100,000 people, when I asked them to support this conference, they rallied around the world, and I have 100,000 names printed up here in microscript just to save paper, because we care about the environment. 100,000 people have signed this petition, Mr. Guterres, and I'm just going to read a few words to you. Enough is enough. UNRWA must be dissolved and replaced. In the last few weeks, it has been revealed. Again, Mr. Guterres, you say UNRWA is doing life-saving work. It's been revealed that 12 UNRWA staff took part in the massacre of October 7th, and actually it's another 30 at least that we have evidence were related, so about 42 at least. 1,200 staff at least are part of terrorist groups. 3,000 UNRWA teachers belonged to this Telegram chat group that celebrated the massacre of October 7th. We have an UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, underneath was a tunnel built by Hamas, one of their key assets, a computer server with espionage intelligence center built under UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, with electric cables coming directly from the UNRWA headquarters. Philippe Lazzarini, Mr. Guterres, your head of UNRWA, he was asked about it. His response was literally, quote unquote, the tweet, UNRWA does not know what's under its headquarters in Gaza. So even though 10 years ago, we know from reports that the parking lot was sinking and everyone looked away, see no evil, hear no evil, nobody knew anything. Really not very credible. And we'll hear from Ambassador Dennis Ross, the former U.S. peace process envoy, and he'll have a few words to say about that. Mr. Guterres, you said that you were horrified about the terrorist attacks in our petition. 100,000 people said you could not pretend to be horrified by this news because for the last decade, UN Watch sent countries and yourself warnings about UNRWA staff support for terrorism. The UN did nothing except to attack the messenger. The United Nations repeatedly, and UNRWA especially, attacked us, saying that we're against refugees when we were doing the work that the UN failed to do, exposing their own teachers and school principals who are regularly encouraging and promoting terrorism. A few bad apples? Really? It's not a few bad apples. We documented hundreds, and in every case, when an UNRWA teacher glorified Hitler, glorified Hamas terrorist attacks, in not one instance was there a fellow, one of his or her peers, who said, I'm shocked when Elham Mansour of Lebanon in May 2022 said, slaughter all Jews and Israelis wherever you find them. This is your obligation by Allah. Not one of her peers said, Elham, I'm shocked. You're such a bad apple. This is not what we do. The contrary. All of them liked it, and when we go on the likes, and my colleague Dan Smith prepared a video a few years ago, and you see who clicks like, another UNRWA teacher. Like. The rot, it's not rotten apples, it's rotten to the core. I'm going to conclude by saying this is a moment where the international community has to decide if an agency that is supposed to be humanitarian is actually complicit in barbarism. It's a moment where the funds are frozen and we can take action. That's what this conference is about. Everyone will have their own views of what they want to say. So I'm speaking for myself, but I know I'm speaking for many. We're at this turning point. The next few weeks will be crucial. We're going to hear from our experts and victims today. And at the end of the conference, I will share with you where we're going to go forward and take action. So thank you all for coming. And with that, I would like to go to our first speaker, which will be Ambassador Meirav Eilon Shahar. She is the superb permanent representative of Israel to the United Nations. She has the hardest job in the world. She has to be permanently defending Israel before the so-called UN Human Rights Council. And she does incredible work. We're all in awe and admiration of her skills. And thank you, Meirav, for being here and representing the government of Israel.
Thank you very much, Hillel, and thank you for gathering us, to you and your team, for this very timely conference, I have to say. And also thank you for the work that you and your team have been doing for the last decade on UNRWA, exposing many of the things that you've just referred to and bring them to light. Unfortunately, not many listened as they should have, and especially not the United Nations. Indeed, I am coming right now from the opening of the Human Rights Council, where the President of the General Assembly himself said that UNRWA is indispensable lifeline. And of course, the Secretary General Gutierrez said that UNRWA is the backbone of assistance to the Palestinians. So indeed, as you've mentioned, there is closing of ranks among the different agencies of the United Nations to make us believe that there is no alternative. But I'm here to say that there is an alternative, and there must be an alternative to UNRWA. Must be an alternative. If anything, that October 7th showed us, and I don't think that too many were surprised, but showed us very clearly and very vividly, is that workers of UNRWA itself were involved in the massacre of October 7th. Directly involved, that's A. That UNRWA workers held hostages in their homes. We know it from returned hostages that they were held. And soon we will hear also from Ayelet. We know that Hamas has exploited UNRWA facilities for years and years, and they were shielded basically by UNRWA facilities, like the headquarters, the database that was found under the UNRWA headquarters, but this is just one example. The fact that Hamas diverted the aid supplied by UNRWA that was supposed to go to Palestinians, civilians, was evident. But what the IDF has found in the last 4 months, evident for everyone who wants to see it, who really wants to look in and see it and acknowledge. The data is there, the pictures are there, the information is there. So even if there was any debate before October 7th, whether the intelligence is correct, whether it's just rumors, which it wasn't, because we had evidence over the years as well, I think that the argument and the disagreements should stop. And the international community and the United Nations itself must acknowledge that Hamas has actually, and together with UNRWA, basically, I want to say interlinked. Interlinked because you have such an infiltration of UNRWA, of Hamas into the UNRWA workers, that in a sense, what UNRWA is allowing Hamas to do is they're allowing them to shield them, to embed. What we're doing is the international community is paying UNRWA, and UNRWA basically is allowing Hamas to do what they do best, is to embed themselves among civilian population. And this must stop. I can tell you from my own experience, the clock here is making me nervous. No, it's okay, that I was the director of the UN Political Affairs in Israel between 2009 and 2012, and I dealt directly with UNRWA. In 2011, we already wrote an official letter to UNRWA indicating names of people that we suspected are terrorists. We never got a response. I can tell you the 2 of the people that are on this list are still employed by UNRWA today. Not surprised, right? Teacher and a principal. The same in 2012. We wrote another letter. No surprise there, no answer there. And also, some of the people, later on, it was discovered in 2017 that one of them became really a leader of Hamas, so he couldn't keep his day job in UNRWA as well. But it's not something that started only in October 7th. We've already alerted UNRWA officially, and that's only from my own experience. I can't say what happened after I left, but I will not touch about the refugee definition of UNRWA because I know that both Einat and Adi probably will touch it in length, but there is no doubt in my mind that it's also perpetuating the conflict itself. What is being taught in the schools has been discussed for years. Very little was done about it. But at the end of the day, what Mr. Gutierrez and Mr. Lazzarini need to ask themselves is how many of the attackers on October 7th, not only those that were directly, those that were directly involved, not only those directly employed by UNRWA, how many of them were educated in UNRWA school? We're talking about thousands of terrorists that infiltrated Israel. How many were educated by UNRWA school? And certainly, it seems that the schools of UNRWA have cultivated a culture of hate and not a culture of peace that we are all hoping for over the years. To me, it's clear that Israel will not be able to continue to work with UNRWA in Gaza. To me, it's clear. We do welcome the countries that have suspended the assistance to UNRWA, and we welcome the 2 investigations that were open. I do want to say about the international review group that is headed by the former foreign minister of France, Colonna. They have included certain institutions, indeed Nordic ones, but what we would expect is also to include experts on security, counterterrorism, and vetting process, because the vetting process obviously has failed completely. And this is the responsibility of the employer. When the United Nations employs someone, they should have a clear vetting process, which they don't have. They don't have, and you cannot roll the blame to someone else. You are the employer. So we would expect this inquiry also to include experts, not only humanitarian experts, but also to include experts on counterterrorism, security, and vetting, as I said, and also the TOR, the terms of reference of their commission needs to be more concise, not too broad, but more concise. What are we looking at? We are looking to see how do you actually prevent the employment of terrorists. I mean, it sounds as simple as that, but that's not in the TOR. That's not in the terms of reference. How do you ensure, how do you make sure that in future you won't employ a terrorist? How do you ensure that Hamas or the Islamic Jihad will not infiltrate your organizations and use your infrastructure to their benefit? So this all needs to be, it remains to be seen how they will deal with it. Indeed, it's a very short time of span of investigation that they have allocated themselves. But I have to say, for me, representing Israel, knowing what we know today on October 7th about the involvement, the direct involvement of UNRWA employees in the massacre, I don't see a way for Israel to continue to work with UNRWA in Gaza. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Our next two speakers are co-authors of the essential book to understand UNRWA, and I shared it before we went online with the audience, but The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. Deech, Schwartz, and Einat Wilf. Einat, this is about 3 years ago. When did it come out? A little bit more?
In English, it came out in 2020, and it was first published in Hebrew in 2018.
So you're going back, the original in Hebrew, nearly 6 years ago, and nearly 4 years ago in English. The world cannot say it didn't know. If you read this book, it's a brilliant historical analysis of how UNRWA was created and what it became. It's essential reading. I was rereading it again this weekend when I was up in the mountains. And I recommend anyone who's watching online, you want to understand about UNRWA, read this book. We're so honored to have the co-authors with us. We're going to first give the floor to Deech Schwartz. He is a fellow at the Misgav Institute, co-author of The War of Return. And maybe, Adi, you can tell us what is wrong with UNRWA.
So,
in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
In 5 minutes.
It's a big challenge. So first of all, thank you for having me. And I do agree that this is a golden opportunity to put an end to UNRWA, and we should act upon it. So the problem with UNRWA is that it is a war agency. I know that Western donors, Western countries, the media, usually people talk about UNRWA as an aid agency. And even now we're talking about what alternatives we should find in order to provide aid to the Palestinians. But that's simply not what UNRWA is about. What UNRWA is actually doing is supporting the Palestinian narrative, which I'll explain in a minute, providing generations of Palestinian fighters, combatants, willing to commit violence against Jews, against Israelis, and in addition, giving terrorists like Hamas and earlier PLO and other terror organizations all the time in the world to plan their terror attacks while UNRWA is taking care of their social services, health, education, etc. So they have all the time to sit underground and plan all those attacks. What Palestinian narrative am I talking about? The most basic and common Palestinian narrative about the conflict is that the entire land belongs to the Arabs, and that there is no place, there is no room for a Jewish state, no matter what its borders. It was a crime against justice that it was created in 1948, and the only remedy, the only just solution to this conflict is simply to undo the state of Israel. And in this context, what's being planned, a return of refugees, as the Palestinians call it, means exactly that, putting an end to the state of Israel. The Palestinians are promoting the idea that millions of refugees, by now, of course, they're descendants and descendants and descendants, fourth and fifth generation, who left their homes in 1948, have a right, an internationally recognized right to return to their homes inside the state of Israel. And this would be, of course, part of the way of how we remedy the injustice of 1948. Given the demographics, as you all know, the number of Jews in Israel, such a massive return of refugees actually means that Israel is no longer the nation state of the Jewish people, but becoming another Arab state. So the idea is not only to bring the Arabs back to the land, but to bring the land back to the Arabs. Now, how does UNRWA support this narrative? First of all, it tells the Palestinians that they have a right of return, which they do not. If you follow all the statements, proclamations of Lazzarini and other commissioners of UNRWA, they will say day in, day out, that indeed the Palestinians have a right of return. UNRWA inflates the number of refugees artificially by more than 20 times. If we applied international standards, the number of refugees, Palestinian refugees, would be perhaps 200,000. Instead, UNRWA counts, I think, 5.8 or 5.9 million. That's 20 or 30 times more. UNRWA never crossed a name out of the lists. They never resettled even one refugee from 1949. And just to make clear how it works, in the Kingdom of Jordan, you have more than 2 million registered refugees. All of them have citizenship, have Jordanian citizenship. Now, all around the world, whether you're in Sudan or in Bangladesh or in the Balkans or whatever, there are cessation clauses. Refugee status ends at some point, not with the Palestinians. The Palestinians can be, again, only them. They can be both refugees and citizens of another country, which contradicts the entire point of being a refugee. And this is 2.2 million. It's not, an individual. The same is true for what is happening in what we used to be called mandatory Palestine. I mean, Israel plus the Gaza Strip plus the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Again, more than 2 million registered refugees, right, or Palestinians. Now, they live in Jenin, in Hebron, in Gaza, in Rafah. They are Palestinian. They live in Palestinian cities. They certainly consider themselves to be in Palestine. And at the same time, they are refugees from Palestine. Again, this exists only in our case. You cannot be residing in Serbia, for example, and being a refugee from Serbia. The basic condition of being a refugee, the definition starts that you're outside of your country. So they are in Palestine and refugees from Palestine. By the way, they know why they are refugees from Palestine because they consider the entire area, as I just said in the beginning, to be Palestine. So now one has to ask the question, why does UNRWA do it? What's the logic? Why do you inflate the number more than 20 times? Why didn't you resettle? Now, this contradicts any common sense unless you understand that UNRWA is actually a war agency, that its whole purpose, its mere existence, everything that it does is in order to continue the conflict against the state of Israel. Now, I just want to finish with a few quotes, not me saying this. This is how the Palestinians reacted after the suspension of funding. So this is like the last 2 or 3 weeks after the decision of so many Western countries to suspend funding. This is what the Palestinians had to say. By the way, some of them, for example, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, right? This is the moderate Palestinian PA. Mohammed Shtaya said in a press conference that UNRWA embodies the accumulating memory of the suffering of the Palestinian refugees. Throughout its years of activity, UNRWA has been a source of hope for the Palestinian refugees for returning to their homes. Again, not aid, not education, not healthcare. This is what UNRWA is about. Fatah, again, in a statement issued on January 28, the refugee issue will remain the crux of the Palestinian cause. Another quote, this is the last thing, an author from the Al-Quds newspaper, by the way, not in Gaza, he's not intimidated, he's not controlled by Hamas, so he can say whatever he wants, and he says the following: one of the goals of UNRWA is to ensure the return of the Palestinian refugees and their descendants to their original homes, meaning inside Israel. For the Palestinians, UNRWA was never an end in itself, but rather a means to achieve the goals. This is the main goal for which UNRWA was established, to actualize the return of the refugees. Many of the services that these organizations once provided have diminished and decreased, and many refugees no longer benefit from this international organization. But the fact of its existence has international political, moral, and legal impact on the refugees' historical right of return. So this is what UNRWA is about. The bottom line is that as long as UNRWA exists, the war continues, and this is why it should be ended. Thank you.
Thank you, Adi. Our next speaker is Dr. Einat Wilf. She is a leading thinker in Israel on issues such as Zionism, the future of Israel, human rights, feminism, and she is co-author of The War of Return, and is a friend. And she took time. Kate was in London, flew here, came right from the airport, and has to go back very soon. So it really means a lot that you're with us, Einat Wilf.
Thank you so much, and really thank you for doing this. Sometimes I wryly joke that in 1947, the United Nations let it slip that it supported the establishment of a Jewish state, and it has spent all the years since trying to walk that back. We will never understand UNRWA unless we understand that it's first and foremost a Palestinian organization. I sometimes say that if you want to understand UNRWA, think about an airplane, which is a lovely machine until it gets hijacked and flown into a building. In the same way, UNRWA, like Adi described, started with the best of intentions to settle Arab refugees from the war, was hijacked by the Arab refugees themselves to become a purely Arab-Palestinian organization for the singular cause of ensuring that the Jewish state knows not a day of peace until it is undone. This is what UNRWA is. It has a thin layer of Italians and Swiss with beautifully cut suit who ask for money, because it's very difficult to give money to a Palestinian who will tell you from the river to the sea. It's much easier to give it to a nice-speaking Italian. So what do? UNRWA is a classic case of you get what you pay for. So we need to make sure that we pay for something else. For 75 years, money, legitimacy, support, services, aid were funneled to the perpetuation of the myth that Palestinians are still, uniquely from all the tens of millions of refugees throughout the 20th century, that they are still refugees from a war that we think ended 75 years ago, but they don't think it ends until they win it to their cause of no Jewish state. So all the Western legitimacy, the global legitimacy, the funding, the aid, the services were funneled to the perpetuation of the myth of the refugee status and to the belief in the fictional idea of a right of return. And lest we think return is an innocent idea of just feelings of nostalgia to a home that belonged to a great-grandparent in where today is Israel, October 7th is return. October 7th is the realization of the Palestinian vision of return. It was never an innocent idea. It always had the element of violent, brutal triumphalism over the Jewish state. So all the money supported that for 75 years. So what we need to ask right now is not who will replace UNRWA. That doesn't matter. What? What will replace UNRWA? And what needs to replace UNRWA is any mechanism that only funnels legitimacy, support, money, aid, to those who are taken off UNRWA's rosters, those who are no longer registered as refugees, those who sign and make it clear that they understand that they're not refugees and that they possess no such right of return. Only then can something be built. Adi and I are on the record now with books and essays and lectures and meetings telling donor countries for years, don't give a single dollar, don't give a bag of cement to UNRWA anywhere, and certainly in Gaza, as long as the people of Gaza, 75% of whom are still registered by UNRWA as refugees from Palestine, Don't give them anything as long as their dominant ideology is not to think of Gaza as the home which they wish to make into the pearl of the Mediterranean, the Dubai of the Levant. As long as their ideology is to literally use Gaza as a launch pad to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. Adi and I are on record as telling donor countries, you are guaranteed that all your money, your aid, your bags of cement will go into turning Gaza into a highly effective war machine in order to exercise the brutal vision of return. So this is what we need to say. Doesn't matter who replaces UNRWA. What? Reverse the equation. Legitimacy, money, aid, services will flow only to individuals who have been stricken off UNRWA's rosters, if it still exists, and who themselves testify that they understand that they're not refugees, that they do not possess a right of return, and they have no intention of liberating Palestine from the river to the sea. And I want to end with one thought. October 7th should put an end to the notion of the poor Palestinians, the ones who constantly need aid, money, support. The Palestinians are a highly capable people. October 7th required years of planning, massive investment in infrastructure, strategy, discipline, vision, a perverse vision, but vision. The Palestinians are not an incapable people. They are a people with terrible priorities. For a century, they decided to devote all their substantial capabilities, not to building something for themselves, but in order to destroy the Jewish state. And as long as this is their ideology, anyone who gives them any kind of funding, aid, and legitimacy is guaranteed that this will be funneled to the destruction of the Jewish state and to continued war. And if people really want peace, like Hillel says, they really want to abide by the principles and the vision of the United Nations, reverse the equations, support those who want to put the war behind us, not the ones who want to keep fighting that war. Thank you.
Thank you, Einat and Adi, for your leadership. Indeed, as I say in their book, The War of Return, they basically told us about October 7th in so many words. No one can claim that they were surprised. On this note, we turn to our next speaker. You know, the United Nations, as I said, is trying to reassure donor states to reinstate funding by the creation of two different inquiries. One of them is by this entity called OIOS. We have one of the world experts on this entity. His name is Edward Flaherty from here in Geneva. He's a senior partner in the Swiss law firm of Schwab, Flaherty et Associés. He's an expert on UN investigations and legal proceedings, and we're really honored that you're here with us.
Thank you, Hillel, and good morning, everyone. As Hillel said, I'm an American lawyer. I've spent the last 30 years representing international civil servants in labor disputes against the UN and other international organizations. I've represented both staff members accused of misconduct by OIOS and those who have reported misconduct to OIOS to hopefully have the perpetrators pursued. If I had more time, I would recount a number of my own cases which demonstrate the unsuitability of OIOS to take on the investigation into UNRWA. I'll just mention a couple. The first arises out of some accusations of sexual abuse in the Central African Republic in 2015-2016, both against the French military and also against UN and UNICEF staff. The allegations against the French military were investigated by an independent commission, and they confirmed a number of the allegations of sexual assault, sexual abuse, questions of genocide. Then OIOS took on the allegations against the UN and UNICEF staff. There were 164 specific allegations. Out of those, OIOS was able to confirm None. They did OIOS, the OIOS investigation did result in the suspension of the UN whistleblower who reported the abuse, Anders Kampas, who was also a Swedish diplomat. And you ask, well, why did they fail? And the simple reason is that the guardians cannot investigate themselves. OIOS is neither neutral nor independent. The Undersecretary General in charge of OIOS depends on a good evaluation from the Secretary General for her salary increases. She presumably has a permanent contract, but then her subordinates, many of them who do not have permanent contracts, have fixed-term contracts, also depend upon a good evaluation, performance evaluation from their boss. And this, in my view, creates an unspoken incentive that OIOS will find what the administration wants them to find, or what they perceive they think the administration wants them to find. OIOS, like most of the other internal investigation units in the UN and other international organizations, operate essentially as a secret police for the heads of the organizations, often being told, this is my presumption, find me Mr. X and I'll find you the crime, or don't find Miss Y and don't find her crime. Even in a case investigated by OIOS for sexual assault involving the former UNHCR High Commissioner Ruth Lubbers, brought by my own client Cynthia Burzak. In that case, OIOS did find Lubbers guilty of sexual assault, but they then sent the report to Kofi Annan, who buried it and publicly exonerated Lubbers. Only when the OIOS investigator secretly sent the OIOS report to the press was Lubbers finally forced to resign. In my view, because of their lack of independence, their conflict of interest, and lack of neutrality, no matter what the outcome, I think if they are mandated to investigate UNRWA, I think that it will just discredit the OIOS itself and the UN. In addition, OIOS has no mandate to undertake criminal investigations. They can only deal with staff members. Now, UNRWA's already fired 12 of the alleged staff members, so they have no obligation to participate in the investigation. And even if there were criminal charges to arise out of the investigation, which is possible given if some of the UN managers knew of the staff members' membership in Hamas or some of their activities before, then there might be criminal claims possible. In my own experience with OIOS and the other UN organizations, I really have no confidence that an OIOS investigation will result in an objective finding. And I'm skeptical that even based on what Hillel had mentioned too about the former French minister and some of the other organizations that are participating in the review, given their public expression of support for UNRWA, I don't believe that it will be objective. My hope is that a truly independent and neutral commission will be appointed with subpoena power, and that the immunity of all those involved, the managers of UNRWA and other staff, will be lifted so that in advance of any investigation, so no matter what the outcome of the investigation, if there is criminal culpability, that then those responsible can be prosecuted. Only then, I believe, can the UN's member states properly decide what should be the outcome of the investigation and the future of UNRWA. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. Much appreciated to hear from an expert on, again, the United Nations is telling us there are two critical inquiries that will decide whether hundreds of millions will be reinstated. So this is a vital point, and we've just heard from one of the world experts that we should not expect a credible, independent investigation from either of these two supposedly independent investigations. Our next speaker, reminds us about why we're here and what this is about. The war that we're in began on October 7th, and Ayelet's son was murdered as part of this massacre, and it has a direct link to UNRWA. I'm going to give her the floor in a moment. I'm just going to mention Mr. Guterres, I know that his staff is listening, and he's right next door. He's having meetings with foreign ministers. Mr. Guterres, last time you were here, you met with the Iranian foreign minister, Amir Abdollahian. He represents a terrorist regime. You shook his hand last year. I'm assuming that today you're going to do the same thing because he just spoke the terrorist foreign minister. And if you're shaking hands with terrorists today, perhaps you'll have a moment. I appeal to you, and this is being broadcast online around the world. I appeal to you in the name of United Nations Watch. We urge you, take a moment. You're just meters away. Could you please meet with Ayelet, mother of a victim, because she's about to tell you that one of your own employees, one of your own UNRWA employees, abducted the lifeless body of her son into Gaza and still has it. I now give the floor to Ayelet, and thank you for being here.
Good noon, everyone. Last week, the Kidnapped Families Forum held a press conference, and the world heard my cry, a mother's cry. I would like to tell you a little bit about Yonatan. I will tell you about the core values as a 21 years old and the way he was raised. The young people that go to these parties, the Nova Party, believe in freedom, in democracy, in acceptance, in accepting every one of us as equal. Yonatan and his friend believe in acceptance and care for our world, for the earth, and for all human beings and animals. My young son's generation don't care about religion. They don't care about sexual orientation. They don't care about race. They just want to live peaceful and happy life. My son was not armed. He was not in a war situation. His only weapon were his smile, as you saw, happiness and charm. Yonatan was full of life. Always smiling, always joking. He did everything with joy, and people always wanted to be near him, to be his friends. Yonatan's entire existence was full of life. Even now, we cannot think about him in relation to tragedy and murder. Yonatan is the life, and the life is Yonatan. You are asking me why UNRWA needs to be replaced. An UNRWA's worker kidnapped my son. A social worker for a so-called humanitarian organization kidnapped my son. How can someone working for an organization that claims to do good in this world do something so cruel and unhuman? How can the UN pay this man who dragged my son's limp body on the ground and then picked him up if he was a prize into Gaza? How many more lives have been ruined by this person hauling my son like he is even a human being into a UNRWA car? Are there any other hostages held by UN employees even as we are talking right now? Does the UN hold my son? Do you know where he is? Bring him back to me. Mr. Guterres, look at my eyes and answer me. Answer me now. Where is my son? You are next door. You're here. And you have the opportunity to meet me today and tell me, what are you going to do? And how can you bring me back my son? I'm not an investigator and cannot answer those questions. I am just a mother who lost the most precious thing in the world. That is why I am standing here before you today and demanding answers about my sons. We already have proof that at least 42 UNRWA employees took part in the October 7th terrorist attack. For me, there is only one decision. UNRWA was no reason to exist. UN, clear your house. That's all.
In reaction to October 7th, in Israel, it is often said, en milim, there are no words. And in response to what we just heard from Ayelet, en milim, there are no words. But we are here at the United Nations. Secretary General Guterres, as Ayelet said, is right next door. One of his employees abducted her son and took him into Gaza with an UNRWA car. At the minimum, Mr. Guterres should do everything, and obviously he can do a lot, to release her son and the other hostages. And Mr. Guterres, once again, we appeal to you. You're here today. You're meeting with foreign ministers of all kinds of regimes. At least meet and look into the eyes of Ayelet and meet with her. We urge you. With that, we'll move to our next panel. Our first panel was looking at why UNRWA needs to be replaced. I'm going to thank all of the members of the first panel for your superb presentations. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. I'm going to invite the next members of our panel, which will be exploring alternatives to UNRWA. We hear time and again that UNRWA is irreplaceable. That is the official talking point. UNRWA is irreplaceable. Well, we know that's not true. We know that there are humanitarian agencies around the world that serve millions of people. And so I'm inviting the members of the next panel to come forward. And as they do, I'm going to give the floor by speaking to us by video, first to one of the leading figures in the Middle East peace process for several decades, Ambassador Dennis Ross. He's a counselor at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He was the U.S. point man on the Middle East peace process for numerous administrations, Republican and Democrat, and we're honored that he's speaking to us by video. Ambassador Ross, you have the floor.
Thanks for having me. I think it's very important that you're running this program. There's been years and years of discussion about the need to reform UNRWA, the need to replace UNRWA with different programs. Obviously, in the midst of what's going on in Gaza, that's hard to do. UNRWA is the main body responsible for distributing assistance right now. But that cannot be a reason not to take a very hard look at UNRWA and look at changes that need to be made, both in terms of how UNRWA operates on the one hand, and also for basic reforms that are needed on the other. Reforms that, by the way, would have other agencies begin to play a role in place of UNRWA. So what are the key changes I think need to be made? Number one, UNRWA cannot be subservient to Hamas. It's not just that it employs people who are Hamas members, supporters, and so forth. That we know as a fact. It's also that it's clear that one of the most important operational and intelligence centers underground was underground, the headquarters of UNRWA within Gaza City. The argument that this was not something that could have been known, the character of this tunnel was such that it would have been impossible to be in the building and not know or hear what was going on underneath. This was a kind of classic case of hear no evil, see no evil, and not want to discuss any evil. So the subservience of UNRWA to Hamas, that has to end, number one. Number two, there needs to be a thorough vetting of the people who work for UNRWA. There are plenty of lists that are available. Certainly the United States has a list of terrorists that OFAC produces. There should be vetting of the people who are working for UNRWA and compared to that list. UNRWA has never been prepared to accept anything like that. That is unquestionably something that needs to be done. Thirdly, beneficiaries of UNRWA also need to be checked against these lists. It's not just the people who are employees of UNRWA, it also has to be those people who are benefiting from it. Fourthly, there has never been a needs-based standard by which those who are getting support from UNRWA, material support from UNRWA, are being tested. Those who are not and who don't require assistance shouldn't be getting it. Fifthly, I'd say the idea that every generation, no matter where they live, should still be treated as if they're on the books as refugees makes no sense on its face. So this is another area where I think there needs to be basic reform with regard to UNRWA. Beyond what I would call reform, I would say there are other programs that ought to take the place of UNRWA. The World Food Program should be responsible for distributing food rather than UNRWA. We know that, again, you can't go cold turkey here. You need a transition, even if you weren't in the midst of a war, where UNRWA is really the only vehicle for the distribution of assistance. The fact is, at some point when this is over, UNRWA was providing about 60% of all the meals in Gaza before this. Why not focus on having the World Food Program take its place? And by the way, the monies that are giving to UNRWA, you would deduct that and you would give that money to the World Food Program so that it could be performing this role. There is also the question of the refugees who are in Lebanon or who are in Jordan. In the case of Jordan, they're full citizens. And as full citizens, it's not clear why again, UNRWA should be the vehicle for this. There can be other, again, if UNRWA is providing material support to people in Jordan and Lebanon, that material support should still be provided, but it shouldn't necessarily, at least in the case of Jordan, where they are citizens, unlike in Lebanon, where they are not. UNRWA should not be the vehicle for it. The vehicle in Lebanon could be the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. In Jordan, should be something that's worked out with the Jordanian government, and monies that are given by different countries to UNRWA could be given directly to the Jordanian government to provide to those who are in fact Jordanian citizens. I mean, these strike me as an array of different kinds of reforms and or steps that could be taken and should be taken. One thing we should learn from this war, UNRWA, if not by design, certainly by consequence, effectively was a vehicle for Hamas. One thing that should not be the case in the aftermath of this war is that UNRWA continues to play the role it did. Again, I'm not saying you go cold turkey, but you should create a transition away. Because what UNRWA is doing, if UNRWA maintains the same role, if UNRWA is given this kind of continuing responsibility, it will allow Hamas to come back in. There is no possibility of producing reconstruction in Gaza if Hamas remains in control, and if UNRWA is a vehicle to help it be in control, it means Hamas will continue to divert any materials away to rebuild its military capability, to reconstitute itself. And if that happens, first of all, donors won't invest in reconstruction because they know not only about the diversion of materials, but they also know sooner or later Hamas will trigger another conflict. So you're not going to get reconstruction. The key formula for the end of this war is going to be demilitarization and guaranteed demilitarization for reconstruction. There's no doubt that the Israelis are actually succeeding when it comes to demilitarizing Gaza. I would actually like to see Israel redefine its objective as the demilitarization of Gaza, identify the level at which they feel they have produced enough so that you can then have international and regional mechanisms that are guaranteed to ensure there can be no remilitarization. Part of ensuring no remilitarization is Hamas is not only not in control, because no one, again, is going to invest if that's the case, but also UNRWA cannot be a vehicle for it being able to reestablish itself in Gaza. If there's any lessons at all that we've learned, that's one. So bottom line here is UNRWA must continue to perform humanitarian service right now during the course of this war, but there needs to be a transition away from UNRWA over time, and the kind of reforms I spoke about earlier really need to be instituted. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, Ambassador Ross. Ambassador Ross, you've just delivered what I think are extraordinarily significant remarks. There is no one on the international scene who's been more engaged over decades, over at least 3, if not 4 decades, in the Middle East peace process, meeting with all of the Arab leaders, all of the Israeli leaders, Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, all of them the past few decades. You devoted your life to the peace process. You're a longtime supporter of the United Nations, and yet you said, I'm quoting, UNRWA was a vehicle for Hamas. You called on, we need a transition away from UNRWA. Again, Secretary General Guterres, who's right here, who's telling all of us, and everyone is parroting, that UNRWA is irreplaceable. Ambassador Dennis Ross is saying the opposite. So thank you, Ambassador Ross, for your very powerful words. With that, I go to a world expert on UNRWA because he used to work for UNRWA for 7 years. Sitting next to me is James Lindsay. Between 2000 and 2007, James served with UNRWA, first as a senior lawyer, then as the legal advisor and general counsel, in the latter 2 positions overseeing all of the agency's legal activities. He's also served with the United States Department of Justice and the Multinational Force and Observers. We're truly honored that he's taken the time and effort to be with us today and to share with us his unique perspective and expertise.
Thank you, Hillel. It's very kind. It's still, yes, good afternoon now. And thank you for all being here. And thank you again for that long introduction. During my years with UNRWA, I suggested several ways that the agency could improve its operations. But I found that these sort of suggestions were not welcomed by the people in charge. I started as Hillel said, as a senior lawyer, but not the senior lawyer, and neither the senior lawyer nor the other members of the UN staff were receptive to really any changes to be made to UNRWA. After leaving the agency, as a visiting fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, I wrote a monograph entitled Fixing UNRWA, which urged UNRWA to make a large number, actually, of reforms. It's now 15 years since I wrote that, and other people have also made critiques of UNRWA and suggested ways it could be improved. And as near as I can tell, all of those suggestions, mine and other people's, have remained unwelcome, and they certainly have remained unheeded. With the recent intelligence indicating the large numbers of UNRWA staff are associated with terrorist groups, a lot of the calls for reforming UNRWA have somewhat fallen by the wayside and been replaced by calls to end UNRWA. But how exactly would that be done? There are three ways that I can think of that it could, in fact, be ended. The first one is the General Assembly of the United Nations created UNRWA, and it could end UNRWA. As a practical matter, that's probably not going to happen. Most recently, in December of 2022, the General Assembly once again renewed UNRWA's mandate for another 3 years. The votes on that were, there was one vote against renewing UNRWA, there were 10 abstentions, and there were 157 votes in favor of continuing UNRWA. So as a practical matter, as I said, I don't think it's going to happen in the General Assembly. Another way to end UNRWA is for the donor nations to withhold their donations, which is a bit of what we've been hearing today already, moving the donations from UNRWA to somewhere else. In the past, that has not been overwhelmingly successful. In 2018, the Trump administration eliminated all American aid to UNRWA. But other countries, including European countries, increased their aid to try to offset the loss of the American aid. And to a very large extent, that did occur, and UNRWA was not forced to make any changes of significance at least. In 2019, somewhat better story, Switzerland, Belgium, and the Netherlands temporarily withheld their donations due to a scandal involving UNRWA's Commissioner General. And their donations were renewed, but only after the Commissioner General had resigned. So there was a bit of a modest success there. Right now, we have, as I think some of the speakers have mentioned, a situation in which 18 of the largest donors have withheld their donations. They have paused them. But the language used with this discussion of pausing has suggested that the donations would resume once the UN internal investigations, which we've heard about, were completed, and UNRWA gave assurances that corrective action was being taken. Still, that's not very encouraging, really, but still, there are two things about this that are unprecedented. Firstly is the large number of donors who are pausing their donations. That's 18, and they constitute at least 2/3 of the amount of money UNRWA needs to meet its professed budget. The second thing is that the U.S. is being pressed by the Congress to eliminate funding, and that has forced the administration to mention that it is looking at alternative, i.e. non-UNRWA, ways to provide aid to Gaza. Again, that's something that the Americans have not done before, and one can hope, at least, that other donors who have paused will be trying to do the same thing. So I'm I'm not sanguine, but I believe it is possible that the donor nations could defund and thus end UNRWA. But it is not 100% sure by any stretch of the imagination. A third way to end UNRWA is for the host nations to refuse UNRWA access to the areas under their jurisdiction. Now, as a practical matter, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon will not take that step. They see themselves and they want to be seen as being supportive of the Palestinian cause. And in addition, they fear that they may be the ones who end up paying the bill. Israel, though, which controls the borders of Gaza and the West Bank, is different. Israel has been hinting that it would be using a defeat of the terrorist forces in Gaza and the subsequent Israeli occupation to create a new and peaceful self-governing authority. There have been a lot of rumors in the Israeli press about exactly what that would consist of. But as part of the ambitious plan, UNRWA would be replaced by other organizations as quickly as possible without creating some sort of a humanitarian disaster. The Israeli military in particular has been concerned that removing UNRWA immediately would cause them great difficulty in their operations. As of last Friday, though, these hints have become more realistic when Netanyahu, in fact, the Prime Minister himself, said that it has become official Israeli policy to remove UNRWA and to create a peace-loving state in Gaza. However, even if the Israeli plan succeeds in Gaza, and even if it is successfully transmitted to the West Bank, it really doesn't appear that UNRWA is going to disappear like tomorrow. Not in Gaza, certainly not in the West Bank, and for sure not in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. It just won't happen. So, in my view, while UNRWA still exists, whether in whole, that is in all 5 of those areas, or even just 3 of them, even if it just continues in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, the donors, if they can't end UNRWA, they must insist upon it being reformed. The reforms are ones that people have indicated for many years that should be made. And I'll give you the most important ones. The first one, of course, which is it's become to the front because of the events of October the 7th, is that all UNRWA staff members and all beneficiaries as well should be vetted for terrorist ties, using information provided by the donor nations and the relevant host nations, including the Israeli government. Second, as I think Ambassador Ross mentioned, those agency-denominated Palestine refugees who are not actually refugees, according to the UN Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees, should be removed from the rolls of UNRWA. There are about 1.8 million of these oxymoronic citizen refugees in Jordan alone. This is out of the, about 5.9. So in the stroke of a pen, you could reduce the size of UNRWA dramatically. Thirdly, as I've urged on UNRWA many times in the past, they should move from a status-based, i.e. a person who's called a Palestine refugee by their definition, to a need-based provision of services. There's no particular reason why people who don't need aid should be given aid. It makes less available for those people who do need aid. Fourthly, UNRWA should eliminate from its currently used educational materials all anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and other material incompatible with UN principles. And it should immediately revise its textbooks and curricula as necessary. This has also been urged on UNRWA for many, many years, and the excuses they give for not doing it are really quite weak. They insist that they have to use local textbooks so that when their students graduate from grade school and go to high school, that they will be properly prepared. This is as if there was some sort of UNRWA mathematics, which is different from Syrian mathematics. There's no reason why, and I've proposed many times, that they should have all their materials vetted by somebody, some neutral body like UNESCO, to remove any anti-UN principles material. And lastly, I've also repeatedly said, and it still is a big issue, UNRWA, and particularly its commissioner generals, should refrain from making political comments, which they do all the time unnecessarily. They could leave that to the UN echelons here. So in summation, I think for the first time, as Adi mentioned, there's a real possibility of movement toward ending UNRWA, at least, as I've said, in Gaza and the West Bank. But that said, so long as UNRWA operations continue, donor nations should demand that those reforms I've just mentioned should be enacted. Doing so would make UNRWA more rational, less political, and much smaller, and when the time comes, easier to end. Thank you.
Thank you, James Lindsay. We have experts on our panel who have devoted their lives to humanitarian affairs and helping refugees and migrants. Our next speaker is Zlatko Zigic. He served at the United Nations Migration Agency, also known as IOM, for 20 years, including as Chief of Diplomatic Mission in Moscow and Regional Coordinator for Central Asia. When the Secretary General says that UNRWA is irreplaceable, we have an expert who can tell us what he thinks about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hillel, and thank you for everything that you're doing. It's really appreciated. Well, I have to begin by recognizing that UN Secretary General Guterres and UNRWA Commissioner General Lazzarini premise that UNRWA is irreplaceable is simply put wrong, and it does not represent truth. Gaza has a population of 2.1 million. UNRWA lists 1.7 million of them as refugees, people who have lived in Gaza for generations under Egyptian, Israeli, and then Hamas control. And this is an absurd statistic intended to advance a political agenda, not reflect reality. The agency, UNRWA, where it is hard to distinguish agency employees from someone that works for or supports Hamas or PIJ or Iranians, today claims 5.6 million people as refugees, and this is simply false. There were 800,000 refugees in 1948. How could that number have grown to such an extent with the population in question aged and died? UN's inflated statistic comes from the fact that it counts as a refugee anyone with a paternal ancestor who fled the territory of mandatory Palestine in 47 and 48, whereas when dealing with any other conflict, neither the UN nor any international law consider refugee status heritable. I have to go through this presentation fast because essentially I would like to say a lot, and I've put together 25 pages of of presentation, but I suggest we maybe publish it on your site.
Absolutely.
So that we have that we don't repeat what has been said before, and that we just don't run out of time. Well, we have established that UNRWA is not a refugee agency. And as my colleague mentioned, there are estimates by credible intelligence organizations, as well as by open sources, both in the United States and the European Union, that approximately 200,000 Arabs displaced in 48 are still alive, and most others are not refugees by any rational criteria. They could be internally displaced, but they're not refugees. That means that despite what UN Secretary Guterres is saying, UNRWA could be relatively quickly replaced by a system of other humanitarian organizations and UN. again, I would need to elaborate more on issues related to problems of corruption and vetting. But I will just mention one question. Would replacing UNRWA with a different organization not lead to similar problems? If the staff remains the same, the answer is yes. And then again, I have to again re-stress the importance of vetting. And I will make a couple of subtle points in a couple of minutes if I have time. And again, the problem is that whenever the UN operates in a totalitarian zone that's controlled by a totalitarian regime, for example, in Russia or in Iran, or by a terrorist group, as in the case in Gaza, where Hamas was the government, the UN gets infiltrated and subverted. And I would be very happy to testify. I would be very happy to testify what happened to the mission that I headed once upon a time.
In Russia.
In Russia. The same case would happen here, not least since UNRWA has a terrorism problem, and it has a terrorism problem because UNRWA is simply structured to have one. And why? Because the UN does not recognize Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, PF, LP, etc. as terrorist groups, even though each one is designated by the US, by the EU, by the United Kingdom as foreign terrorist organizations. UNRWA is UN-mandated agency, so UNRWA does not recognize these groups as terrorist organizations either. In other words, to United Nations, to UNRWA, Hamas and Islamic Jihad are political identifiers. And UNRWA makes it clear it doesn't discriminate based on the politics. So you have guaranteed a situation where you will have another agency that replaces UNRWA, again, taking in terrorists. And therefore, the vetting, again, is, I think, crucial in this equation. Another reason why UN is saying UNRWA is irreplaceable is because many policymakers looking for ways to distribute aid quickly, and UNRWA's existing infrastructure makes that the easy answer. But nothing stops us as owners of the United Nations and the donor states, and of course Israel as the host country, to remove UNRWA from the equation and turn over the entire infrastructure to other United Nations and humanitarian organizations. Again, let me be clear. Ideally, there shouldn't be any UN organization. There should be probably Israel or a friendly Palestinian administration that would prosper and grow, and that donor countries could fund. And that would be an ideal option, an ideal world, but we are not there yet. I would mention one organization that would be a good example as a replacement, and I'm going to quickly describe three models that we could apply in this particular situation. I would mention UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The rationale for this is while the people living in Gaza are not refugees, they're IDPs, internally displaced persons today. This gives UNHCR rather obvious jurisdiction, probably to some extent to UN Migration Agency as well. So I think the donor parliaments and Congress could force the issue by mandating a phase-out of assistance provided to UNRWA and then making money available to UNHCR as the lead agency and other agencies with relevant mandates instead. I would again talk about vetting, but I'm going to skip that just to talk about the models. We have essentially three models. The one that I mentioned with UNHCR that's applicable in situations of refugees and internal displacement, which is substantial. Next slide. It would be, is called the refugee coordinator model. We have to, okay, actually these are the three models. Basically, we can see the refugee system, the cluster system, and the development system. I would opt for the refugee system that would have UNHCR as the lead. The arrangement set out in the UNHCR and OCHA's joint, OCHA is the coordination body.
Humanitarian affairs.
For the humanitarian affairs. A joint note on mixed situations, coordination in practice, that was in 2014. That's very important because of the coordination and because of jurisdiction. Those were confirmed by the Emergency Relief Coordinator and High Commissioner in 2018. The RCM, the model, maybe can we change the slide? The RCM, so we will see actually how it looks. The RCM model applies in all refugee and internal displacement situations throughout the refugee IDP response. Whenever, it doesn't matter whether the emergency is new or protracted, or whether the refugees, IDPs are living in camps. This is the cluster system, another one, please. But it's very similar to this one.
Here's the RCM, you have it here now.
Yeah, it's very similar to this one. Then you would have actually, this is the one, yeah. So you have here the government, and you have the representative, that would be the refugee coordinator. Then you have the multi-sector group, and then you have essentially a form of clusters, which are essentially sectors. And just to give you an idea what organizations could be in these sectors, just to give you an idea, emergency telecommunications is the first one. That would be WFP. Food security would be WFP and FAO. Health and nutrition would be WHO and UNICEF. Shelter and non-food items, UNHCR as a lead, possibly with IOM. Education, UNICEF as a lead, and in some cases, Save the Children together. Livelihood, UNHCR together with ILO, World Bank, FAO, and other agencies. Another system similar to this would be the cluster system mentioned before. It's practically, it's very similar, except that the humanitarian coordinator would be in charge of that particular system. You would have clusters of groups of humanitarian organizations, both UN and non-UN, and each of the main sectors of the humanitarian action. And they are designated by the Interagency Standing Committee, and they have the clear responsibilities for coordination. But let me just probably conclude with an example that would be quite interesting, where we have a mixed situation, where we have essentially several models intertwined. We have a situation in Sudan, which is the biggest crisis of epic proportions.
Happening right now.
And there you had a cluster system in place, and then this cluster system was surged. So it was beefed up on the...
How many people are we talking about in Sudan?
Well, again, let me give you just brief situation at a glance. We are talking about, as of 2 days ago, 8.1 million people displaced by conflict. And this is since April 23. 24.7 million people are in an urgent need of humanitarian assistance. About 14 million children in a need of urgent assistance. So we could call it a catastrophe of epic proportions. And what has been happening there, as we speak, back in November, there was a UN body called UNITAMS, which stands for United Nations Integrated Transitional Assistance Mission in Sudan. The host government, which is the government of Sudan, has filed a letter to the United Nations Security Council requesting the termination of this organization, and this is now in the process. It should be terminated in the next 2 days, literally, but we'll see if that happens. In the meantime, the donors, and again, that's also a prerogative of a donor, have decided which agencies to support in which areas. Sudan is a huge country. And let me just give you an idea. The US, as the main donor, responded with the following distribution of roles and responsibilities. So it doesn't have to be exactly according to the cluster or refugee system. It will also be according to the capacities of each and every agency. So let me just give you a quick run. USAID is the main donor, as well as the US State Department. For food security, they're supporting WFP, and WFP has managed to reach to almost 5 million people across Sudan between the 15th of April until mid-December.
How many millions?
4.8 million people.
So the World Food Program was able to reach 4.8 million people, and in Gaza,
In 8 months.
Gaza is about 2 million.
In 8 months. But let me tell you some more interesting data. Regarding health, okay, that's a little bit unconventional approach. You have USAID and the State Department. They support the IOM. That's for the health. The Office for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, it's UNHCR, UNICEF, UNFPA, the Population Fund, and a whole bunch of NGO partners to deliver life-saving healthcare across Sudan, including mobile clinics. The outreach has been tremendous. When it comes to nutrition, again, a little bit unconventional approach. You have IOM, again, funded by the USAID and the state. IOM, UNICEF, WFP, WHO. And okay, in the last 8 months, UNICEF has screened 5.4 million children, ages 5 years and younger, for malnutrition, and admitted more than 300,000 children for treatment, for emergency treatment in the clinics in Sudan. Regarding protection, again, you have UNFPA, you have UNHCR, you have UNICEF, you have obviously a whole bunch of NGOs. Very important, UNICEF provided women and children with gender-based violence prevention, risk mitigation. That's very important. Also, the USAID has provided UN Mine Service to work on this. So it has been quite a comprehensive and complex emergency. Let me just conclude with the WASH, that's water, sanitation, and hygiene. Again, a little bit unconventional. USAID provides IOM, UNHCR, UNICEF, WHO, and NGOs to improve the access to safe drinking water, sanitation, all across Sudan. Only UNICEF provided safe drinking water to an estimated 6 million people all across Sudan between April 15th and December 31, 2023. So we are talking about deploying this enormous structure within 8 months, basically from the scratch. And so I would perhaps conclude. I would have some caveats, but I will not. I will put it in the paper. But let me just conclude. Even though the ISC principles on 21st February called for immediate and permanent ceasefire and for continued support to UNRWA and other humanitarian organizations operating in Gaza, a strong approach by the host government, Israel, and by the key donors and donor organizations could definitively lead to quick suspension of compromised UNRWA functions, which means practically all of them, and lead to initiating a comprehensive humanitarian response. I would recommend with UNHCR as a lead that could then call on ISC to activate system-wide mobilization and scale up the operational capacities without UNRWA in Gaza, and not only in Gaza, but also in West Bank and wherever UNRWA was present. Thank you.
Thank you, Zlatko Zigic. You've worked 20 years for the United Nations, and I think you've made the case very clearly that those who are saying that UNRWA is irreplaceable, well, clearly that's false, and there are numerous other agencies that you outlined that can do the work. Our next panelist is Bonnie Glick. She's flown here from the United States. She is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a group that's been very outspoken on our issues. She served as deputy administrator of the USAID, that's the Agency for International Development. She previously served 12 years as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, including overseas tours in Ethiopia and Nicaragua. She served on the National Security Council, the U.S. mission to the United Nations. She brings extraordinary experience as a diplomat and a businesswoman, and we're really honored that you're here with us today.
Thank you, Hillel. I want to thank you and your great team at UN Watch for inviting me to speak here at this International Summit on Transitioning Beyond UNRWA. As you said, I served as the Deputy Administrator and Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Agency for International Development for 2 years. And during this period, we took a serious look at U.S. assistance to Palestinians. For a variety of reasons, we determined that assistance to Palestinian NGOs, the Palestinian Authority, and significantly to UNRWA were not good investments of American tax dollars. Whereas UNHCR focuses on resettling refugees in third countries and allowing them to build new lives, as we well know now, UNRWA focuses on the perpetual victimhood of Palestinians while giving them only one glimmer of misbegotten hope that one day they will take over the land of Israel and cloak it in red, green, white, and black colors. Did Palestinians living in Arab countries ever benefit in the way resettled refugees from all around the world have benefited? The simple answer is no. So why does UNRWA continue to play a role in Palestinian society? Why are Palestinians the only so-called refugees in the world who can never grow out of refugee status? The United States was built as a haven for people who were oppressed around the world. Refugees in America are resettled. Their children are educated, and they have hope for a better life for themselves and for future generations. But future generations are not called refugees. They're called Americans. I've been calling for the dismantlement and defunding of UNRWA within my own government for over a dozen years. It is a tragedy that it took October 7th and the wanton, sadistic slaughter of 1,200 Israelis, Americans, Thais, Nepalese, Argentines, Danes, Canadians, and a dozen others, as well as the abduction of over 240 men, women, children, elderly, and babies, and the rapes of still untold hundreds of women, girls, boys, and men for the world's eyes to be opened. When the world's eyes were opened, there were a few eyeballs that remained glued shut, unyielding in their support of Hamas, unwilling to see the facts of the violence of October 7th. Among those who were willfully shielding their vision were UN Women, the ICRC, WHO, Secretary General Antonio Guterres himself, and of course, Philippe Lazzarini and his fellow underworld bosses in UNRWA. Underworld is actually an apt description. As we've all learned, Hamas had an enormous tunnel directly underneath UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza. Electricity, lighting, refrigeration, plumbing, and lodging for Hamas leaders all were provided by UNRWA. What a shock, of course, for Mr. Lazzarini to learn that the world finally learned his agency's secrets. Both Messieurs Lazzarini and Guterres deny any knowledge of Hamas's activities in collaboration with UNRWA, despite the fact that UN Watch has been providing them information about the worst kept secret in the Middle East for easily a decade. I believe that Secretary Guterres and Mr. Lazzarini should not represent the future of the United Nations. So what does a future for the UN without UNRWA look like? What happens with the growing, not shrinking, number of Palestinian refugees? First and foremost, Hamas must cease to exist. Second, every single hostage held by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Gazan civilians, including numerous UNRWA employees, must be released to Israel. Among those hostages, of course, are at least 5 American citizens. A stewardship committee, likely led by Israel, will slowly begin the process of figuring out how to handle all of the so-called Palestinian refugees. Certainly, those who wish to be resettled in third countries, and there will likely be millions of them, should be free to do so. For the purpose of resettlement, a temporary solution could include the UNHCR. But I would recommend a firm, time-bound lifespan for this effort. Given the Palestinian so-called refugees are now into their 5th and 6th generation in that status, UNHCR should act with alacrity to resettle those wishing to move. Many countries have offered sanctuary. Some Palestinians may choose to remain in Gaza. There will be a slow process of building from scratch a civilian-led government. Those Palestinians will be charged with rebuilding lives, and funding for that should come principally from their Arab brethren. It's all but certain that countries like China will be slow to respond to calls for rebuilding of Gaza. China has not been financially generous to Palestinians in the past. Indeed, images of the Jewish state called to the International Court of Justice on charges of non-existent genocide against Palestinians leave CCP leaders quaking in their boots, as they are actually committing genocide against their own population of Muslim Uyghurs. When I was in government, we called out actual genocidaires like China. The UN's kangaroo court is inexplicably accusing the one country that rose from the ashes of actual genocide of perpetrating this heinous crime. I'm fairly certain that many countries will step up to help a civilian-controlled Gaza emerge. It will take time, but people of goodwill have a habit of demonstrating their generosity even when their goodwill is so often taken for granted. The UN and UNRWA must stop taking people of goodwill for granted. They have proven that they are not worthy.
Thank you, Bonnie Glick, for your very powerful remarks. The last expert on our panel of exploring alternatives to UNRWA is José Garson. He is a former expert at the United Nations Capital Development Fund. He'll be joining us by video. He has 20 years of experience in development projects with least developed countries and anti-poverty strategies. We're honored to have his expertise on this panel. Mr. José Garson.
The UN has been working many years in zones where there were conflicts. And we even invented the famous scale going from relief to development. And I participated myself in Central America, in Nicaragua, in Salvador, to programs funded by the UN and the government of Italy to reconstruct these countries. We literally reconstructed the country, starting from the courts, going to the schools, and it was a complete reconstruction. The program was called PRODERE, and the UN agency that worked very efficiently to implement the program was UNOPS, based today in Geneva. Now, if you say that on the one hand, UNRWA has participated in all the problems, and a lot of people should be brought to justice and everything, that's one side. The second side should be to try to understand what would be the need to cater to all these people. And I'm not talking only about the refugees. This is something very, very special that UNRWA has. They cater a sort of segment of the Palestinian population, since they cannot really make the difference. So it's officially the refugees, but it's also the others and so on. This has to be taken off. The R in UNRWA shouldn't be, relief and works, which is an expression that dates from the 40s. Nobody uses this expression today. So what I envision, and I'm not taking stand about the Palestinian state, whatever the political solution is going to be, but you have a number of Palestinians, and you don't have any administration in charge of A, building the structures, B, getting them functioning, and this applies not only to Gaza, but also to Jordania, to Syria, to Cisjordania, and so on. So there is a need, so to speak, for a development bank. I'm not going to use the word bank, but there is a need for it. And there is a need for a governance structure which reflects the powers today in the world, not only the big powers from the Security Council, but the regional powers, including Israel. So the only way to get there, in my opinion, and following the habits of the UN administration, would be, number one, to get everyone around the table to put all the ideas on the table. Of course, you have to have someone who takes the initiative, and I think the UN Watch would be perfect to take this initiative. So step one, gather everybody and try to see how this development agency could be set up, what would be its terms of reference, and so on, and so the beneficiaries, and so on. Number two, this meeting should create the terms of reference of a consulting team that would go in the field and come back with the figures, different things that could structure the feasibility study of the new UNRWA. And then this can be presented at the UN in New York, either at the General Assembly or Security Council. The carrot in the whole thing is that if the institution is well designed, there will be much more money going to the Palestinians. Now, if you look at the UNRWA site, they're asking for donations. It's like if they are begging people to give money, and obviously they don't have enough money for the job they have. So, but if you have a structured institution that follows the rules that other institutions follow, then there will be a lot of contributions. There will be, not only the Arab states, but the European states and everything. It's a development agency. So everybody is interested in development. And of course, there shouldn't be a one person at the head, but of course, a whole governance structure that ensures that checks and balances are present. I think you have a very, very important role. UN Watch has a very important role to play, and I support what you are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, José Garson, as our final expert panelist on alternatives to UNRWA. With that, we move to our distinguished final panel, which is composed of legislative representatives from UNRWA donor states. Of course, the United States is the lead donor to UNRWA, giving more than $300 million a year. And we're honored to have Representative Chris Smith from the U.S. Congress, who's flown in here to Geneva to be with us here today. I'm just going to say a word or two about Chris Smith. He's someone who has been extremely active in promoting human rights in Congress for many years. He was elected in 1980. The laws that he's brought include the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 to combat sex and labor trafficking in the U.S. and around the world. He's introduced laws that were passed to help individuals with autism, laws to promote religious freedom, and many other human rights causes. Currently, Representative Smith serves as chairman of the subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee of Africa, Global Health, Human Rights, and International Organizations. In that capacity, he has been one of the world leaders, if not the world leader, on holding UNRWA to account for all the issues that we're talking about today. I'm sure he'll mention it, but I just want to show he is the author of Stop Support for UNRWA, Agency Act of 2024. This is an essential piece of legislation that passed in the Foreign Affairs Committee recently. Representative Smith has invited me numerous times to speak in Congress. Here at the United Nations, I've been interrupted and shut down. They've removed my name from the speakers list numerous times, but Congressman Smith, on the contrary, gave us the floor and was able to speak about many of these things, including presenting this report. And I'll just say a word and then I'll conclude, is that January 30th, Congressman Smith, Chairman Smith, convened a hearing, a joint hearing of two subcommittees to deal with UNRWA failures and incitement to terrorism. And knowing that that was on the calendar when it was revealed about the UNRWA staff complicit in terrorism just a few days before, I believe that was an essential factor in prompting the United States. They knew that they were going to come up with this hearing, and America decided they're suspending funding, and then you had a cascade of all the other countries, Canada, European countries, Australia, all suspended. And I want to give credit for that to Congressman Smith for being the leader and making all of this happen. You have the floor.
Hello, thank you so very much. It's an honor to be on a panel with my fellow parliamentarians. Thank you for the great work you're doing in your respective Congresses or parliaments. I also want to say to Ayelet, I add my voice to everyone here in asking that Secretary General Gutierrez meet with her, do it now. You know, there's an old saying that if you say you don't have the time, you haven't stated a fact, you've stated a priority. And he needs to make this a priority. To watch that video, when I first saw it a couple days ago, I was moved to tears. And now I just saw it again, and it's like, this is barbaric, what this UNRWA person has done and what so many others who are part of UNRWA and Hamas have been doing. So special thanks to Hillel for his extraordinary work in exposing and confronting pervasive anti-Semitism in the United Nations, including at the UN Human Rights Council, right behind us right now, and of course UNRWA, but other specialized agencies and the General Assembly and elsewhere, and for demanding respect for the state of Israel and for Jews everywhere. In the past 9 months alone, Hillel has testified at three separate congressional hearings that I've chaired, last June, then again in November, and then, as he just mentioned, the joint hearing with my good friend and colleague, Chairman Brian Mast, on January 30th. Hillel is incisive, he is compelling, and he is a truth teller. He told us that UN bodies routinely apply a double standard to Israel. We all know that, but it needs to be said. And I remember back in 2002, I had a hearing when we were pushing the idea of having a large meeting at the OSCE. I was the chairman of the Helsinki Commission, which is the OSCE part in the United States. And we had Natan Sharansky come and testify, one of the greatest. I tried to get to see him with Frank Wolf in the 1980s. We went to Perm Camp, and he had just been released. He is an amazing, awesome human rights defender. Well, he had a recipe or a definition that is not often realized by people here in the United Nations, and that was the 3 Ds of anti-Semitism: demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. And Hillel hit that out of the park in showing how the UN has done that everywhere here and in New York at the United Nations. He also talked about human rights officials like Navi Pillay and Francesco Albanese, called them out, quoted them to show how brazenly anti-Semitic they are and continue to be, and they're in high positions of power. And he'd also explain with chilling precision how UNRWA indoctrinates Palestinian youth. And really, I would ask everybody watching this, if you haven't done it recently, reread the Hamas Charter of 1988. I read major portions of it on the floor of the House, and even though I've read it many times, it got me anew and grabbed me anew just how hate-filled it is. One of them is that if you see a Jew and that Jewish person is behind a rock, that the rock itself will cry out, "There's a Jew here, come and kill that person." It is perverse, and yet UNRWA embodies that in their teaching, especially for children. Earlier this month, as Hillel just mentioned, the House Foreign Affairs Committee debated and passed my bill, H.R. 7122, the Stop Support for UNRWA Act, and the vote was 30-19. The legislation now heads to the full House for a debate and a vote. It prohibits any contributions to UNRWA or to the regular budget of the United Nations for the support of UNRWA. In order to meet existing or future humanitarian needs in Gaza, it explicitly states that, quote, "nothing in this act may be construed to preclude the provision of humanitarian assistance to any agency or entity," but then it has a caveat. The Secretary of State has to certify that those entities or individuals don't promote violence, terrorism, or anti-Semitism. So we vet them before U.S. taxpayer money flows. Meanwhile, the United States Senate has passed legislation in mid-February that appropriates humanitarian aid for Gaza, estimated at $1.4 billion. And it, too, says clearly, unmistakably, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, no money to UNRWA. UNRWA is a corrupt, anti-Semitic terror complicit agency, and everybody needs to say that, and everybody here at the United Nations, including at the UN Human Rights Council and every other agency, need to recognize it. It radicalizes Palestinian children with anti-Semitic hate. It's a child soldier factory. I had hearings in the past, and I actually had some of our witnesses with the textbooks, reading the hate that is filled to overflowing in those textbooks, and it was amazing. They're teaching kids, youngest of ages, to hate Jews, and we wonder why these child soldiers grow up when they're 12 or 13, or and they're ready to kill any Jew that they come in contact with. We all know about the pause. I'm very concerned that the pause will be short-lived, and will unfortunately, the investigation appears to be woefully and unnecessarily limited in scope. It remains to be seen whether the investigation will be an in-depth and comprehensive, top-to-bottom investigation into UNRWA's direct role in promoting anti-Semitic hate, to include all the staff and look at the books, look at everything. If they just narrowly look at the 12, I can tell you they're going to say they've been removed everything's done, move on, and now resume the funding. And that would be an egregious error if that happens. I also remain, like you do, very concerned about the UN investigations, not just as to who's doing them, but they're going to do the same thing. Look at the 12 and then move on. There's a great article in the Wall Street Journal, it's an op-ed by Peter Anthony Gallo, who worked for the UN OIOS, and the headline was, "The sham investigation of UNRWA is likely to whitewash the organization's terrorist ties and could even force the offenders forced rehiring." And, you know, my good friend Ed just made so many good comments about how flawed those processes are and have been for decades. And now we're in real time. We're about to see this happen all over again. Peter Gallo says, after spending 4 years as an investigator, I can confidently say that the UN investigation will amount to nothing. He went on to say that, among other concerns, he argues, Secretary Guterres has said any UNRWA employee involved will be held accountable, including through criminal prosecution. Really? That's commendable, he goes on, but it's meaningless. The UN doesn't have prosecutorial authority or the ability to extradite people from one country to another, meaning any legal accountability would have to come from the national authorities. Whatever the UN says, Hamas certainly won't send them from Gaza to sit for a criminal trial in Israel. UNRWA's deplorable record of anti-Semitism is nothing new. Nothing new. My good friend from New Jersey, from Washington, who was here today, who just spoke from the USAID perspective, she's been calling it for at least a dozen years, and there's been a multi-year cover-up. I've tried for over 20. In 2003, I offered an amendment to a State Department bill for 2003-4 that said no money for UNRWA. It passed the House, got killed in the Senate by inaction, and everything went on as usual. And the UNRWA lobbyists would descend on Capitol Hill, talk to members and staff, and said, "Oh, everything's fixed. We can move on. Turn that page." And nothing could be further from the truth. So, you know, that goes back, and I really focused in that amendment on the textbooks because I was appalled, like all of you were, at how bad it is. As was mentioned by Mr. Lindsay before, in 2018, Trump rightfully suspended all U.S. funding to UNRWA, as he should, based on the record. Unfortunately, it was backfilled by our friends in the European Union. Since 2021, the Biden administration has resumed lavish support from UNRWA, and we've spoken out. We have not been listened to. And he has donated more than $1 billion. Years to date, U.S. taxpayers have spent about a little over $7 billion on UNRWA, despite all of its horrific flaws. Finally, pursuant to UN Security Council Resolution 2720, Secretary Guterres, General Guterres, named Sigrid Kaag as the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. Among the job description is to facilitate, coordinate, monitor, and verify humanitarian relief consignments to Gaza. However, according to the Times of Israel, Sigrid is an outgoing Dutch minister. That's fine. She's married to a senior PLO member and deputy minister under Yasser Arafat. She casts Netanyahu as a racist. And then, most egregious, in my opinion, she worked for UNRWA. So what kind of empathies will she have? And it does beg the question, should we be concerned about that? If we let it, it'll be business as usual. And the factory that creates all of these kids who learn to hate, any of you ever watch South Pacific, the great musical? There's a great song in there, you've got to be taught. You've got to be taught to hate. That's what UNRWA does, that's what Hamas does, and we will get no change, and this cycle of violence will persist. This is the time. Thank you for your great leadership.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for your very powerful remarks and for your leadership on this issue. We look forward, all of us, to working together to try to bring true peace and human rights to the region instead of perpetuation of war, terrorism, and hate. With that, we go from the United States to the European Union. Mr. David Lega, sitting on our panel right here, is one of the most inspiring individuals I've ever met. He has an incredible life story. He is challenged by a severe congenital disability and yet began swimming at age 12. He would go on to set 14 world records, including at the 1996 Atlanta and 2000 Sydney Paralympic Games. In 2008, he published his inspiring book, Hands Free. In 2019, he was elected to the European Parliament. That's for 5 years now. He serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Human Rights Subcommittee, very active on such issues as disabilities, children's rights, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which Chris Smith is also incredibly active, and for the Uyghurs, he's chair of the Uyghur Friendship Group. In addition, I have to say that David has been a leading voice regarding the United Nations. You know, one of the things that's happening today, we didn't talk about it, but I mentioned it briefly, the foreign minister of the terrorist regime, the IRGC, the ones who sponsored the Hamas massacre, is right here next door, Amir Abdollahian. He's the mouthpiece for a terrorist regime, and he's shaking hands today with the Secretary General and others, speaking at the Human Rights Council. When that regime was elected to chair the UN Human Rights Council Social Forum, most of the world was silent, not David. He led a group, I think it was 34 members of the European Parliament that spoke out against this outrage, and he's been a leader at holding UNRWA to account. David, we're honored to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. The honor is mine, Hillel. I'm so happy to be here in this amazing company of ambassadors, distinguished experts, guests, fellow elected officials, and everyone also listening, not the least, all my friends at UN Watch. So thank you so much. And as you said, we are gathered in Geneva, a city that is long been known as a place of refuge and reform, but also intense sectarian strife, and a city which for more than 100 years has symbolized the dream of peace among all people. We are gathered on the margins of the Human Rights Council with Secretary General Guterres just next door, together with many ministers attending. What do you think they will talk about in 2024? What will they say about Israel, about Hamas, about terrorism, about peace? And thanks in large part to the essential work of UN Watch, we know that the Human Rights Council's history of resolutions against the State of Israel, more than against all other countries combined, year after year, even as it itself now includes repressive authoritarian members like China and Cuba, just to name two others. Of course, there are also other members with different values. Israel has no better friend than the United States, represented here by distinguished members of Congress from both major parties. Today I speak to you as a Jew, as a Swede, as a human being, and as a Christian Democrat in the European Parliament. So what do I see as the path to peace, and specifically about the role of UNRWA? As I said in October, from the floor to the European Parliament, from the river to the sea, all hostages must be free. This includes all those in Gaza held hostage for years by Hamas as well. So how has Hamas held Gaza captive? We have known about their brutality for many years now, but they have in part also been let off the hook of good governance by the very United Nations agency tasked with meeting the needs of 1948 Palestinian refugees. As the scope and size of that agency has grown over the decades, Hamas hasn't really needed to fully govern in Gaza, hasn't needed to spark sustainable growth or heal the sick or provide proper schools for children. They could focus instead on terrorism and torture, starting with Gazans themselves. UNRWA, to a large extent, would run the hospital and teach the kids. So what was UNRWA teaching them? Throughout my mandate, I have expressed my deepest distress over the issue of Palestinian textbooks, including some used in UNRWA schools filled with messages of hate, anti-Semitism, and incitement to violence and jihad against the Jewish people and the State of Israel. Textbooks bought with EU taxpayers' money. I have repeatedly and directly called on the European Commission to account for this and to stop it. The EU is UNRWA's third biggest donor. Not counting EU member state funding, my own country of Sweden comes fourth. But Sweden as well has now suspended its contributions, and the European Commission is conducting a review. Why? 2 weeks ago, in a joint meeting of the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs and Budget Committees, I challenged UNRWA's Europe Director over credible recent reports alleging several UNRWA staff actively participated in the horrible terror attacks of October 7th, with even more celebrating those attacks in a group chat, and as many as 1,200 employees actually members of Hamas or Islamic Jihad. This in addition to reports of Hamas tunnels powered by UNRWA electricity underneath UNRWA's Gaza headquarters. So it is time to conclude. UNRWA has failed in Gaza, has failed Gazans. The people of Gaza need food and clean water and shelter. Schools fostering respect and peace, not an organization whose staffers pour fuel on the fire of conflict and even join in acts of terrorism. No organization is irreplaceable. So what to do? In the aftermath of October 7th, the EU quadrupled its 2023 Palestinian aid. For 2024, this will go up by yet another factor. In Gaza, this EU aid cannot go through the UNRWA, but to other organizations which have proven their greater responsibility and, not the least important, objectivity. And in the medium and long term, the EU must work together with transatlantic partners like the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, but also with regional partners like Jordan, Egypt, and the signatories of the breakthrough 2020 Abraham Accords to create the conditions for a viable two-state solution in the Middle East. That would guarantee Israel's security, and it would ensure dignity and self-determination of the Palestinian people. This joint effort must first involve security on the ground in Gaza after Hamas is defeated. It must also take the lead in providing for Gazans' humanitarian needs. The resources are there, if there is a will. October 7th was a dark day, and every day since, for Israelis as well as for Palestinians. It is a time for a new day to dawn, with new ideas, new partners, for peace. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your vision and your leadership, and we look forward to working together in the vital arena of the European Parliament. And with that, I want to introduce our next speaker. You know, we're in terrible times. What happened on October 7th, the sadism, the brutality, the atrocities, are acts that are, as the United Nations said in 1948, barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. We saw acts like the Nazis. These are Nazi-like acts, what they did. And, you know, in World War II, in response to the Nazis, we had what we call in America the greatest generation, the people who rose to the moment. And one of these people today who rose to the moment to fight today's Nazis is Assita Kanko, sitting next to me. She is a Belgian politician, author, columnist, and human rights activist. She's known to many of us around the world from her powerful stance that she's taken since October 7th in Europe and in other places in the world where people are either silent or even apologists for Hamas. She has been the opposite. Now, she's born in Burkina Faso. She's lived in Belgium for 20 years. She's been a member of the European Parliament since 2019. She worked in business, served in international corporations, boards of directors. She's a member of the Civil Liberties, Justice, and Home Affairs Committee and of the Foreign Affairs, Security, and Defense Committees. She has been an incredibly strong voice against anti-Semitism and racism. She's running for election in June 2024 in the European Parliament as candidate number 2 on the NVA list. We're truly honored that you took the time and effort to come all the way to be with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hillel. I'm honored to be here. I'm happy that we are here because it's important. We are not here only to speak about the future of UNRWA. It's about our common future as fellow human beings. This is what it is about. I learned about World War II. I learned about everything that happened in history when I was a child in Burkina Faso, growing up in a traditional family, growing up in a poor village, walking barefoot, not even knowing that Belgium existed, and just only aspiring to learn and to become a free, independent, emancipated human being as a girl. And I grew up in this Islamic environment. Everything could have happened to me. I would have never been here, except knowing that people like Rousseau were also in Geneva and didn't know anything more about that. But thanks to education provided by other people than organizations like UNRWA, I'm here today, and I know the things that I know. I learned that I have a responsibility as a human being, and that we are all equal. Nobody should ever have to convince anyone that Jews are human beings. But in religion that I've seen, they call Jews dogs. They call people like me who become secular dogs. This must change. So I would like to share a short story with you to begin with. I was to my first ever Shabbat dinner, And I saw this woman, this friend of mine, preparing for dinner. And like in any other family, she had 4 kids with her husband. And they were like, being rushed, slowing down, arguing, laughing, everything you can find in a family, everything that we daily consider as super boring or irritating, but this is actually what we all fight for. And then when I looked at her and the kids, I thought, this that I'm seeing now, this beautiful moment and everything I'm seeing now is what the radical Muslims and Hamas do not want to see existing. They don't want these people to exist and share this moment that every other person would like to share with their family, that I also share with my daughter, that I share with my siblings and my parents growing up. When I went to speak in January in a school in New York, a little girl of 9 years old followed me until down. When I was about to leave, I was having my coat on, and she asked me, she didn't want, obviously, to ask in front of everyone. She asked me, what should I do? What can I do if people hate me because I'm Jewish? And I could see she was expecting an answer. What can I say? I'm not Jewish. I am a human being. I am a secular Muslim. And I love you so much. And so many people love you too. Just be you, be yourself. And I still feel that we owe this kid and everyone else who asks themselves this question, we are responsible to build a world where nobody should ever ask himself this question. And in that world, UNRWA does not exist. Radical Islam does not exist. The values of enlightenment, European values, do exist and are much stronger. I'm very ashamed that my country, Belgium, is not refraining from sponsoring UNRWA. And you know why? It's because of this deep philosophy of victimhood. When they see people like me, they want to treat us like victims. I know why they hate people like me, because we don't want to be victims. We are human beings, we have a potential that we can achieve. They treat Palestinians like victims. They treat immigrants in Europe like victims. They do not want to unlock your potential. The reason why they continue giving the money is to continue having the votes from a certain populations in Europe that refuse to integrate and that puts Islam above our constitution, above our laws, and above everything we have inherited from. Everything that says that people like me should be free, that all of us are equal. So I think that we need to continue pushing for Europe and for the remaining countries to stop funding UNRWA. We need to make sure that other agencies can take over the job. They're doing it well in other countries. Look at UNICEF, like UNHCR. I think also that whatever replaces UNRWA should make sure that the employees are not necessarily from Gaza. They need to have international, unbiased people to work for them. To see the son of Ayelet, who spoke here earlier, being dragged into an UNRWA car, who wants to be paying for this? Do we want to be paying for terrorism? I did not read my speech because seeing you today just inspired me to say something else. So I didn't want to read the speech that my advisors wrote for me together with me. They're going to be very disappointed because they spent all weekend working. I just spoke from my heart because we have to do something here, and we are all a giant family of human beings, and the individual exists beyond his color, his gender, his race, and his history. We are all human beings, and that is what we need to push from. And if I was Gutierrez, I would do my job. I would do my job. That's what I'm calling him for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Member of the European Parliament, Assita Kanko. With that, we go to our final Member of Parliament from neighboring France. She will speak in French, but I understand that we have circulated in English a translation of her prepared remarks. She's not obliged to say the same things. And those watching online can look, if you click on the speaker, Caroline Yadan, I believe that you will see also the English prepared remarks for those who don't speak French. We apologize, we weren't able to arrange for interpretation. A word or two about Caroline. She's been a family law lawyer in France for nearly 30 years. She's a member of the French National Assembly since 2022 in the 3rd District of Paris. She sits on their law committee. She is vice president of the study group on anti-Semitism. She is committed to the fight against racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of discrimination, including as head a member of the legal commission of LICRA, the distinguished think tank. She fights violence against women and helps students and entrepreneurs. She recently initiated the sponsorship of a statement about the hostages from October 7th by 240 French and European deputies and senators. Nous sommes très heureux que vous êtes avec nous. I give the floor to Member of Parliament, National Assembly, Caroline Yadan.
Thank you, Hillel. I apologize and to speak French, but
C'est à Genève, ça va.
out of respect and for you and for your here, especially for your here. So I will prefer to speak French. Au moment de sa création, l'UNRWA avait une mission. Peu importe l'existence d'une rupture d'égalité manifeste avec les autres réfugiés du monde, qu'ils soient africains ou asiatiques. Peu importe que le statut de réfugié palestinien ne comporte aucune limite dans le temps et qu'il soit transmissible de génération en génération. Peu importe que le nombre de réfugiés palestiniens ait été multiplié par 7,6 depuis 1948, représentant aujourd'hui près de 6 millions de personnes, et que seuls 20 à 30 000 d'entre eux seraient considérés comme tels s'ils relevaient du Haut Commissariat aux réfugiés. Peu importe que 5 millions d'entre eux vivent en autonomie sur un territoire géré par des gouvernants qu'ils ont élus. Peu importe le fait de maintenir les réfugiés palestiniens dans leur statut et dans des camps sans jamais chercher de solution durable pour les intégrer afin de justifier sans doute les subsides alloués. Peu importe que les 800 000 juifs chassés des pays arabes entre 1948 et 1950 n'aient jamais bénéficié, eux, du statut de réfugiés. Peu importe tout cela, l'UNRWA avait une mission. Pourtant, l'UNRWA a failli à sa mission. Sa mission d'éducation d'abord. L'Agence pour les réfugiés palestiniens aurait dû assurer une instruction qui promeut l'inclusion, la vision pluraliste de l'histoire, la tolérance, l'égalité et la non-discrimination. Au lieu de cela, les enfants de l'UNRWA apprennent depuis des décennies la langue de la violence. Quels que soient les niveaux de classe et les matières étudiées, l'enseignement dispensé aux enfants palestiniens incite à la haine et à la passion exterminatrice, glorifie les actes de terrorisme, encourage le djihad, répand l'antisémitisme et diabolise Israël en niant son existence. Les écoles de l'UNRWA sont devenues des lieux d'endoctrinement de la détestation des Juifs et de formation des futurs terroristes. Les Juifs sont sournois, perfides et hostiles. Ils sont voués à la destruction. Mourrez en martyrs et accomplissez le djihad. Manuel, UNRWA, Éducation islamique, 9e, 11e et 12e année, pages 10, 21 et 27. Comptez les cercueils des martyrs. Manuel UNRWA, Mathématiques, volume 1, grade 4, 2020, page 27. Au commencement de la violence, il y a la pensée. C'est pétri de cet embrigadement que des adolescents ont le 7 octobre un couteau dans une main et une grenade dans l'autre, dans une pornographie de l'horreur, massacrer des familles entières, brûler vifs et décapiter des bébés devant leurs parents, violer et mutiler sexuellement des femmes, torturer des vieillards et kidnapper des habitants pour les séquestrer dans les tunnels de Gaza. C'est pétri de cet enseignement que les enfants de 8, 9 et 10 ans ont enjambé les cadavres pour aller piller les maisons des Juifs qu'on avait assassinés. L'UNRWA savait. Elle a failli à sa mission d'éducation. Une mission de respect des droits humains ensuite. Droits humains, c'est-à-dire respect de l'autre, rejet de la violence, du terrorisme et du fanatisme. Pourtant, au lendemain du 7 octobre, plus de 3000 employés de l'UNRWA se réjouissaient de cette orgie de sadisme commise au nom d'Allah et célébraient la pulsion génocidaire des terroristes du Hamas. Pourtant, au moins 12 employés de l'UNRWA avaient participé au massacre et certains d'entre eux retenaient des otages arrachés à leurs familles. Pourtant, environ 1200 employés de l'UNRWA à Gaza sont des membres du Hamas et du djihad islamique et 6000 d'entre eux ont de la famille proche qui travaillent pour ces organismes terroristes. Au sein de l'UNRWA existent donc des criminels pétris de frénésie meurtrière qui cherchent à exterminer leurs prochains. L'UNRWA savait. Elle a failli à sa mission de respect des droits humains. Une mission de transmission de la paix au service des réfugiés, enfin. Seule la vérité peut conduire à la paix. La vérité factuelle, celle que personne, au sein de sommets qui se tient juste à côté, ne saurait ignorer. Celle qui démontre la découverte d'un tunnel utilisé par le Hamas et d'un important centre de données informatiques juste en dessous du siège de l'UNRWA à Gaza. Celle qui laisse apparaître l'utilisation par le Hamas de ressources, installations, eau, électricité, machines de l'UNRWA, afin notamment de construire des tunnels destinés non à protéger sa population civile, mais à entreposer des armes de guerre dans le but de tuer femmes et enfants en Israël et de coordonner la logistique de l'assaut du pogrom du 7 octobre. Est-il nécessaire de rappeler que le fait pour quiconque ayant connaissance d'un crime dont il est encore possible de prévenir ou de limiter les effets est constitutif d'un crime ou d'une complicité de crime? L'UNRWA savait. Elle a failli à sa mission de transmission de la paix. En définitive, l'UNRWA a bel et bien échoué. Albert Camus nous rappelait « Il y aura toujours une philosophie au manque de courage et à la lâcheté. » Alors, suite à ces révélations accablantes, il est temps de faire montre de courage, de justice et d'honneur. Il est temps de mettre un terme à l'hypocrisie et au naufrage d'une agence qui encourage le terrorisme et contribue à perpétuer le conflit en fournissant les moyens nécessaires à ceux qui le maintiennent en vie. Il est temps de penser à l'avenir des réfugiés palestiniens autrement pour éradiquer le mal et permettre aux futures générations de pouvoir vivre ensemble, paisiblement sur une terre partagée, pour que les victimes, depuis la cruauté du 7 octobre, ne soient pas mortes pour rien. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Effectivement, l'UNRWA savait. Merci pour vos remarques puissantes et votre leadership. Et nous nous réjouissons de travailler ensemble pour assurer un avenir différent. With that, we are going to take a break. We're going to have additional interventions by video from members of parliament from Norway, Canada, Italy, and other countries. We're going to take a lunch break for about an hour. Those watching online, please come back in about an hour's time, and we'll continue this very important summit to ensure a future beyond UNRWA. Thank you very much.
If you
Welcome back to the International Summit for a Future Beyond UNRWA here in Geneva, Switzerland, next to the United Nations European headquarters. We're going through our panel now on lawmakers from around the world. We heard several of them before lunch. We're just returning now. We're going to hear from several members of parliament. I would like now to give the floor to the member of parliament from Switzerland, Mr. Alfred Heer. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for having me. We tried in the Swiss parliament to cut the funding of for the UNRWA by 20 million, but unfortunately we didn't have a majority in December, and we were at least able to cut it by 10 million Swiss francs, but it was unspecific, so we were not successful. But this debate, of course, happened before. Now that we have the proof that UNRWA is really supporting the terrorists, not only with the school books that we know for many years, that they are teaching in school hatred against Jews and glorifying terrorism. This is now that they are helping terrorists, that terrorists are working with UNRWA. This is a new dimension. And we hope that there will be a change in Swiss Parliament and that we will have in future a majority to cut the funding and maybe to replace UNRWA, that we are able to replace it by another organizations, by people that have peace in mind. And we hope that the cooperation with Israel and other Arabic-speaking countries could replace this organization. Thanks everyone for attending, and I think we have also to be able, to speak with people from other countries, with other parliamentarians, and I'm also a member in the Council of Europe. And of course, there it's also a topic, and it will remain a topic, and we hope that we also can make pressure from the side of the Council of Europe that this organization will be abolished.
Thank you, Member of Parliament from Switzerland, Alfred Heer. I will just say that as now a Swiss citizen that I am now, I would be honored to testify. I believe that on March 25th, you're going to be hosting the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, at the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'd be happy to join, as some of the members of Parliament have asked, if it's relevant. So thank you very much. The fact that the Swiss lower house voted 3 times, thanks to your efforts to defund UNRWA, wasn't yet successful, but as you said now, there's new information, a new dimension. Perhaps you will be able to do so next month. With that, we go to Norway. Norway is a major player with UNRWA. The Director General of the Norwegian Foreign Ministry is Lenny Stenseth. She was, up until a few months ago, the Deputy Commissioner General of UNRWA. She famously went to the head of Hamas in Gaza, Mr. Yahya Sinwar, in June of 2021, after the UNRWA director in Gaza, Matthias Schmel, was made persona non grata by Hamas because he gave an interview where he acknowledged that the IDF, the Israeli military, was precise in their strikes against Hamas terror targets and tried to avoid harming civilians. He went off script, so to speak, and Hamas made him persona non grata. UNRWA removed him immediately and his deputy, and Lenny Stenseth, this Norwegian diplomat, went to Gaza and reaffirmed her solidarity with UNRWA and basically kowtowed before the murderous mastermind terrorist Yahya Sinwar. This is in June 2021. So Norway is a very important country. Sadly, the government is on the wrong page here, but we're delighted to have now member of the Norwegian Parliament, Mr. Christian Tybring-Gjedde. You have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for letting me address the Summit for a Future Beyond UNRWA. I don't have all the answers for how to arrange for the future, but I will touch on why the UN and international community is failing. The Oslo Accord from 1993 is dead. The development on Gaza has gone from bad to worse. Hamas had full control and no ambitions to hold elections. In fact, Hamas has the same ambitions they always have had, a total destruction of Israel. And they do this on several levels. Money from the international community is a central part, but there is much more. The children are being indoctrinated from early age. Hatred and dehumanizing of Jews, it's a theme in all schools. For many years, Western policies in the Middle East were national debates. The support for Israel was strong, but gradually this has changed. There are many reasons for this. New generations are growing up and they do not relate to Second World War, but they are also influenced by media, teachers, organizations, and lately the influx of immigration, particularly of Muslims, who all take the side of the Palestinians. Today, these factors are doing Norwegian politics and the voices for Israel small and threatened. In Norway, we have seen large demonstrations, angry protesters who signed with a message from the river to the sea. The hatred of Israel and of Jews are openly expressed. We have even had an incident where a man with a Palestinian background encouraged people on Facebook to make a list of all people who expressed their views in favor of Israel. It gives us flashbacks to the 1930s. European politicians are becoming scared. Their own failed policy over years have come back to haunt them. Today, Norway is facilitating an arrangement that will enable the Palestinian Authority to receive clearance revenues that Israel collects on its behalf. In the wake of the terrorist attack by Hamas on 7 October, the situation between the parties has been deadlocked. The temporary scheme will play a crucial role in preventing the Palestinian Authority from collapsing financially. And further, despite all the critical voices everywhere, Norway has decided to double its contribution to UNRWA. Norway has agreed on a temporary solution in which Norway will serve as an intermediary for holding the portions of the clearance revenues tax that Israel has withheld since 7th October. The Palestinian Authority is then willing to accept the other funds. The Palestinian Authority has welcomed this arrangement and appreciates the effort to find a temporary solution in this extraordinary situation. The Norwegian government calls this an extraordinary situation, and our foreign minister has stressed that he is pleased Norway can assist the parties in this way. And then we are presented with all the arguments of how innocent Palestinians are suffering and that the financial system is breaking down. Or to use the words of our Minister of Foreign Affairs, UNRWA is in a critical financial situation. Major donors are withholding funds following allegations that 12 out of the organization's 13,000 staffs in Gaza were involved in Hamas' terrorist attack on Israel on 7th October. These allegations are shocking and we expect full transparency, the minister said. There must be zero tolerance for such actions. However, we should not collectively punish millions of people for the alleged wrongdoing of 12 staff members. I urge all donors that have suspended their support to think about the consequences. The situation is dire not only for the population of Gaza, but also for Palestinians throughout the Middle East. Not a word on the terror attack on Israel in which an elected authority on Gaza, Hamas, cold-blooded, killed 1,200 Israelis and took 200 hostages. It makes no sense that the UN has its own agency for Palestinian refugees, for at least 3 reasons. One, who are the refugees we refer to, and why are they termed as refugees? What are today's Palestinian refugees fleeing from? The term refugees is not hereditary. We have now 3rd-generation refugees. Most of them were not even born in 1948. The UNRWA is the main reason for status quo. Money is being poured in, little control. The money is financing Hamas terror and makes it possible for Hamas to buy weapons, build infrastructure, and build palaces in Qatar.
Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Christian Tybring-Gjedde from Norway, the Norwegian Parliament. Very important to have your participation. With that, we're going to the United Kingdom, a very significant player in the future of UNRWA. I would like to say a word or two about our next speaker. Baroness Ruth Deech is an eminent British academic, lawyer, a bioethicist. She is the former principal of St. Anne's College at Oxford University. She chaired the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority and sits as a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. I now give the floor to Baroness Ruth Deech.
UNRWA is the problem, not the solution. It hasn't resettled a single person since 1948. Whereas the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which deals with everybody else, with fewer personnel, far less funding, has resettled 50 million people. UNRWA's mission is not to help people, but to perpetuate a political conflict. UNRWA keeps the so-called refugees in a state of misery until they can return to Israeli territory. That would mean the destruction of Israel and the obliteration of its 7 million Jews. The only way to resettle refugees and bring peace is to abolish UNRWA and transfer its functions to the UNHCR, albeit that the iniquitous effects it has created will unfortunately last. That is, UNRWA has poisoned the mind of future generations in the way it has taught Palestinian children to hate, to believe lies about Israel. It's given make-believe employment to thousands of Palestinians. It continues the myth that there are millions of Palestinian refugees who are in fact not Palestinian and not refugees. And it is a bottomless pit into which countries pour money, not only with no return, but money that has been used to murder and take hostages and starve ordinary Palestinians of the necessaries of life. It is noteworthy that the rich Arab countries that surround Israel, they do not reach out to support their Palestinian brethren. The major donors to UNRWA are the US, followed by Germany, and then the UK. In 2022, the UK donated $21 million. Last year, the UK gave £60 million and another £16 million even after 7th of October. It has paused funding temporarily, but given funds to other bodies working in Gaza. Where has the money gone? Now we know, thanks to the investigative work of journalist John Ware, that the money has gone directly to Hamas to build tunnels, secure armaments, and keep Hamas leaders in luxury. The ordinary poverty-stricken Palestinian has seen none of it, and the states who give money are curiously reluctant to follow through to see where their dollars are going. UNRWA has no financial control, no audit. It has mismanagement, sexual misconduct, and nepotism. Its construction works are a protectionist racket. Support for UNRWA contradicts the UK's policy of a peaceful two-state resolution. UNRWA employees were undoubtedly involved in the horrific attacks on Israel on 7th of October. Some were members of Hamas or Islamic Jihad. At least another 1,000 employees have ties with Hamas. Even more of them have praised the 7th of October attacks and expressed anti-Semitism and praised terrorism. Their teachers teach children to glorify violence against Israel and to deny Israel's legitimacy. UNRWA teachers call for murder of Jews and martyrdom. They call for the right of return into Israel itself by violence. All this has been known for years and nothing has been done. It is all entirely contrary, of course, to the UN's alleged values of human rights and non-discrimination. Although, of course, now the UN itself is equally guilty of breach of those values in its hounding of Israel, as opposed to the terrible situations occurring in other countries. What should be done? UNRWA should not be involved in teaching or paramilitary training in schools. All employees with links to Hamas should be fired. Donor funds should be audited to ensure that cash does not flow to Gaza-based terror groups. It should advance the settlement of so-called Palestinians in the countries in which they live, instead of preaching the right of return. The millions who live in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and elsewhere should have citizenship and full rights in those countries, as would be the case for refugees in any other country of refuge. They are not refugees in any case, being neither born nor driven out of the land of their birth. If Palestinians are classified as refugees because a remote ancestor once lived in what is now Israel, then half the world would be refugees. I would be Polish, for a start, the last thing I would want. It is the continued existence of UNRWA that fuels terrorism, twists the mind of future generations, and perpetuates the refugee illusion, rather than putting an end to it. The remains of UNRWA should be folded into the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This latter body serves all other refugees with a budget of about $9 million, whereas the UNRWA budget is $1.2 billion. UNRWA has about $1,000 for every refugee, as contrasted with $1 for the others. No more money at all should be channeled to UNRWA or the other NGOs under its sway in Gaza. Those bodies supply evidence of dubious quality to back up charges at the International Court of Justice against Israel. The end of UNRWA would be the beginning of peace.
Thank you, Baroness Ruth Deech from the United Kingdom, the House of Lords. We appreciate your leadership on these issues and your powerful moral voice. With that, we're staying in the Commonwealth. We're going to my native land, Canada. We have two interventions by video. I'll go by the order in which they were received. We have first Melissa Lantsman from Toronto. She's a member of Parliament for Thornhill. I have many friends there. She was appointed Shadow Minister of Transport after her election in 2021, Vice President of the Standing Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. She's currently serves on the caucus leadership team. She is Deputy Opposition Leader in the Conservative Party, outspoken on holding the UN to account by the principles of the UN Charter. She served in the Harper administration, which a number of years ago was the first country to cut funds for UNRWA on account of its entanglement with terrorism. And this is an issue that Melissa has continued to stand strongly on. So with that, Melissa Lantsman from Canada, you have the floor.
First of all, thanks so much for having me at the conference. I do want to join you in person, but the business in Ottawa has me here today. But I did want to take a few moments to first of all express the disappointment writ large in Canada's move away from what used to be a long-standing position of supporting a friend and ally in the region to something that is almost unrecognizable, something that I never thought that I would see a democratic country who is friends with another democratic country turn their back so many times over and over again. And look, with UNRWA specifically, Canada did join, albeit reluctantly, and what we understand to be a firestorm issue within the current Liberal government in Canada in suspending the UNRWA funding for the duration or for the unforeseeable future. They have, in fact, Canada has, in fact, sent $48 million to UNRWA in the 2023 fiscal year. And they had said that they won't, retroactively revoke any of the funds that have already been dispersed to address the humanitarian need. But the federal government had already made the first four promised payments of $25 million. The question, of course, is why so early, and then when those payments were made. And we've got a minister who's responsible for international aid, who is on the record just as of a few days ago saying that the money for Gaza has been dispersed to UNRWA, and they use that to deliver the much needed humanitarian aid for education and other duties that UNRWA has on the ground, and they've done good work over the years. Now, this of course is not true, and I don't have to tell this conference of the grave concern. In fact, it was the last Conservative government in Canada that put a stop to that funding. It will be the next Conservative government in Canada that will make sure that that pause is permanent. That is the only acceptable answer for earmarked funds for any kind of relief. Now, I thought that I would take a couple minutes to address, what's wrong. First of all, it's very clear an agency of Hamas, decades of well-meaning governments and donors unwittingly funding the brutal campaign of terror, rocket attacks. What we saw, of course, on October 7th, sanctioned sexual violence in one of the worst moments in human history, and certainly for the modern state of Israel. And despite the public claims of zero tolerance policy of hate, we know that students in UNRWA schools are routinely indoctrinated on the hatred of Jews and Israel, glorifying terrorism, martyrism, and the evidence provided was super clear on some of those employees, as many as 12, taking part in the October 7th attack. That's, of course, what prompted the 17 governments, including that of Canada. Canada, more reluctantly than others, took longer than others, including the European Union, to follow the lead of the United States to pause those payments. And of course, I'll mention the details, suggesting as much as 10% of the 12,000 workers with ties to terrorist groups, some actually full patch members of Hamas, and we've seen time and time again problems with this agency. So what do we do in the future? I mean, it's clear that there should be no more Western government funding for UNRWA or any agency that purports to have anything to do with the UNRWA infrastructure that has been set up. That should be a clear promise from any government that chooses frankly civilization over barbarism. We will make the commitment to that, and what replaces UNRWA is important conversation that needs to happen. I think after Hamas releases those hostages, lays down its arms, and surrenders fully to a point where Israelis and Jews can go back to the places where they once live in peace and security in the state of Israel. And of course, we don't have to talk about what's been going on in the diaspora and how governments have chosen politics over principle on outright support for the demonstrations, for the outright anti-Semitism, and as we call it, siding with the Hamas caucus in major parties, in major Western democratic parties all over the world. And there needs to be a voice of reason, and I'm so happy that there are voices of reason in this room, and if they can be amplified all over the world, to never forget, to never let it happen again, and to know that the only reasonable pause is a permanent pause for anything related to UNRWA.
Thank you, Member of Canadian Parliament Melissa Lantsman, Deputy Opposition Leader, for your powerful remarks. We appreciate the time you took to participate in today's event, and I know that you couldn't make it due to parliamentary business. And we are honored to have also from the governing party, from the Liberal Party of Canada, we have Member of Parliament Anthony Housefather. He represents the district of Mount Royal, where I come from, on the island of Montreal. He has served as chair of the Justice and Human Rights Committee, parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Labour, Minister of Public Services, and to the President of the Treasury Board. Among other important positions he held, he was mayor of the city of Côte Saint-Luc, a very important city in Canada. I would like to now give the floor to Anthony Housefather, Member of Parliament from Canada.
Hi, this is Anthony Housefather. I am the member for Mount Royal district in the island of Montreal in the Canadian House of Commons. And I want to thank Hillel Neuer and UNRWA for this really important forum to discuss how we reframe aid given to Gaza. I strongly support Canada's decision to pause funding for UNRWA. The claims that have been made, the allegations of UNRWA personnel being involved in the horrific pogrom of October the 7th in Israel, when innocent men, women, children, civilians were slaughtered, butchered, raped, is deeply troubling. But this is not the first time that UNRWA has been accused of corruption. This is not the first time that I have been disappointed, disturbed, distressed about what UNRWA has been doing internally. Let's leave the question of whether or not the United Nations really needs two different associations that deal with refugees, having different definitions of what a refugee is, and having different policies in place. One of my biggest concerns about UNRWA has always been its curriculum. The idea that UNRWA was teaching local curriculum in its schools and was then adapting it to conform to UN policies. When Canada first signed on to refund UNRWA after the Liberal government was elected in late 2015, we signed on a year or so later. One of the important frameworks in our contract was our right to audit educational materials and be involved in enhancing and replacing the curriculum where there was anti-Semitism or other forms of hate against women, minorities, etc. And I took that very seriously, and my colleague Michael Levitt and I on a quarterly basis would meet with Canadian officials, would meet with UNRWA, and go over the progress. We were always led to believe that this was to replace the pages in the textbooks. Lo and behold, 2 years later, we found out that textbook pages were never replaced. What happened was the very hard work that had been done to develop a revised curriculum was given in loose form to teachers, and they were told when they arrived at these pages in UNRWA schools to hand it out. There was no proof that the teachers ever did hand it out, no obligation on the teacher's part to actually do so. And it seemed to be exactly the opposite of what I had always been told was going to happen, which of course was there'd be a new textbook with these pages in it. And ever since then, my distrust in UNRWA has only served to increase. So I strongly believe that Palestinians in Gaza need relief. That is very clear. I think we all agree with that. Gaza will need to be rebuilt. And we all want men, women, and children living in Gaza and all over the world to live in peace and safety and have healthcare and have education. And the world really needs to do a job to reform how that is happening. I would vastly prefer that a different organization other than UNRWA delivered the support that has currently been delivered by UNRWA. I know that'll take time, but I think the world has to recognize there's a deep cynicism amongst many of us about UNRWA's past, and we would be better served to place the faith of the people of the world and the people of Gaza in a different organization. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anthony Housefather, Liberal Party Member of Parliament from Canada. We appreciate your powerful remarks. We now have the two leading parties of Canada, members of each party, speaking out on this essential issue, with Anthony Housefather saying, quote, "We would be better served to place the faith of the people of the world and the people of Gaza in a different organization." So that's the two leading parties of Canada. That is very significant. With that, we will go to our next lawmaker, and this actually will be our last lawmaker before I give some concluding remarks. It's Representative Ritchie Torres. He is a leading voice in the Congress for human rights, civil rights, justice, equality, and speaking out against racism and anti-Semitism. I'm a huge fan of his. I love seeing his voice on Twitter and on Instagram. As I said before, there are some people in these terrible times who have risen to the moment after October 7th when others are silent. We heard from Assita Kanko, and now Ritchie Torres, someone who's been incredibly outspoken. And we're really honored, Congressman Torres, that you took the time to send us your participation by video. You have the floor.
Hello, I'm Congressman Ritchie Torres from New York 15 in the Bronx. Associate Justice Robert Jackson served as the chief prosecutor in the Nuremberg trials. In his opening statement, he said, quote, "The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish are so calculated, so malignant, so devastating, that we cannot tolerate their being ignored because we cannot survive their being repeated." Those same words should be said about October 7th. Israel cannot tolerate October 7th being ignored because the Jewish state cannot survive it being repeated. For me, October 7th was a crime against humanity so barbaric that it cannot be ignored. It cannot go unpunished. Hamas must be removed from power, and the perpetrators of October 7th must be brought to justice. Israel has a right to defend itself against Hamas in the aftermath of October 7th, for the same reason the United States had a right to defend itself against Al-Qaeda in the aftermath of 9/11. Self-defense is the right and responsibility and raison d'etre of every nation state, including the Jewish nation state. I want to commend Hillel Neuer for turning the light of truth upon the systemic anti-Semitism of UNRWA and the larger Palestinian refugee industrial complex. Not only did your reporting and Israeli intelligence implicate several UNRWA employees on October 7th, but UNRWA itself has long been indoctrinating its students with anti-Israel and anti-Jewish hate. Let me be clear. Hate will never bring peace. It will only bring more violence and more senseless suffering. We must stop perpetuating the ideologies and the institutions that perpetuate hate, pure and simple. We must be clear-eyed about the incestuous relationship between Hamas and UNRWA. Hamas exists not to govern Palestinians in Gaza, but to murder Jews in Israel. UNRWA, long funded by Western tax dollars, has long been governing Gaza at the behest of Hamas, so that Hamas, which sees governing as a mere distraction, could dedicate itself to the murder of Jews in Israel, the construction of terror tunnels in Gaza, and the militarization of its own civilian population and civilian infrastructure. That the international community would cut a deal with the devil is so scandalous and shocking in its stupidity that it leaves one speechless. But that deal with the devil, which has persisted for far too long, is finally collapsing under the weight of its own corruption, and rightly so. Hamas must be removed from power. The perpetrators of October 7th must be brought to justice. And UNRWA, long a purveyor of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish hate, must be replaced. It should be possible for the international community to provide urgently needed humanitarian aid to Palestinians in distress without inciting hate and violence against Israelis and Jews. A sustainable peace will require a demilitarization and a de-Hamasification of the Gaza Strip. It will require a de-radicalization of Gazan civil society, which for far too long has been miseducated by UNRWA and manipulated by its lies. A wise person once said, if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, that is the definition of insanity. The time has come to end the insanity of an ideology that does not celebrate the life of Palestinians, but instead celebrates the death of Jews. We must end the hate, and we must end the insanity.
Thank you, Congressman Ritchie Torres, for your very powerful remarks. We heard earlier from Chairman Chris Smith from the Republican Party. We now have your voice as a leading voice in the Democratic Party. Indeed, as Ambassador David Satterfield, the U.S. envoy in humanitarian affairs for the Middle East, really for Gaza, said it is his understanding that from both parties, there is no longer a will to fund UNRWA. The opposite, there is a clear will not to fund UNRWA. We're seeing it in legislation. And again, in this event, we had both Republican and Democratic voices. And those who voted for Chris Smith's bill in the House Foreign Affairs Committee were both Republicans and Democrats. This is very significant as we move forward. This was the last lawmaker that we heard from. And now I'll just share with you a few remarks that I think express some of the views from our stakeholders today. Where do we go forward from here? To wrap up, we're in a unique moment where, as never before, a majority of the donor states to UNRWA have frozen funding, and they're saying they'll reinstate it depending on these two inquiries, which are due in the next month or two. And we know these inquiries are not exactly independent, and it's quite likely that they're going to say that everything is okay and to recommend the funding be reinstated. But we have this moment, and our summit today, the first ever summit to explore alternatives to replace UNRWA, I believe we can identify 5 areas of action going forward. Number 1, members of parliament worldwide have met here, and we have pledged, they have pledged to work together to unite in bringing in their fellow members of parliament to pressure governments to change their approach and to look for alternatives beyond UNRWA. Second, beyond petitions and appeals, there will be hearings in parliaments. I hope to participate in a hearing in the European Parliament, the Swiss Parliament, potentially other parliaments as well. Third, we need to, as follow-up to our summit, we need to monitor closely the work of these inquiries. OIOS, the Office of Internal Oversight, is number one. The second, this independent review panel headed by former French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna, and three Scandinavian groups, each of which has in the past expressed either some kind of bias against Israel or in favor of UNRWA. So there are very serious questions, but we have to look at the terms of reference and the work of these inquiries and monitor them carefully. Fourth, we need to develop working groups from the participants. We have expertise, and I see here James Lindsay, the former general counsel. He and others have expertise where we could develop a program of action for governments to seriously consider alternatives to UNRWA, to help the people of Gaza, to make sure their humanitarian needs are not compromised in any possible way, but to provide aid in a manner that is not designed to perpetuate the problem for years, which the Swiss foreign minister in 2018, Ignacio Cassis, said is a perverse logic. He said UNRWA is part of the problem, not the solution. So we need working groups to use our expertise and to help governments find a program of action. Finally, fifth, I believe that there is the avenue we need to explore about criminal accountability. When you see a terror tunnel right underneath the headquarters with cables directly linking the UNRWA headquarters to a key asset of Hamas, and you see numerous members of senior UNRWA managers. You know, in 2017, there were two UNRWA managers who were elected to the Hamas Politburo with Yahya Sinwar. We have to explore criminal accountability. What did people know? What did senior managers know about the UNRWA social worker who kidnapped the lifeless body of Einat Samerano? What did they know about the terror tunnels? What did they know about 42, at least, UNRWA officials who were part of the Hamas operations, and about 12 to 1,400 who are also members of Hamas and Islamic Jihad? What did they know? When did they know it? That's number one. We could look at criminal accountability, whether it's in Israel, in the United States, the European Union, or even the International Criminal Court. Finally, it's not just the managers who may have criminal accountability, but the hundreds that we've identified. And the UNRWA terrorgram, we identified a group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers. And previously, for the past 10 years, we've identified about 200 UNRWA teachers and school principals who routinely glorified Adolf Hitler, Nazis, Hamas terrorist attacks. You know, in the United Kingdom, they recently, on January 19th, proscribed Hizbat Tahrir as a terrorist organization. On what basis? On the basis that this organization praised the October 7th terrorist attacks, the atrocities, and that this amounted to encouraging and promoting terrorism. The UNRWA school teachers and principals and other employees that we identified, you can see their names on our website, unwatch.org. There's a section on UNRWA. You see all our reports from the past 10 years. These named individuals, it's not only a slap on the wrist for a social media neutrality violation, they can be held criminally accountable for encouraging and promoting terrorism. We know that there may be immunity, but there may not be immunity for some of these criminal acts. So I think these are 5 areas of action where we can move forward from this summit. I just want to conclude by thanking all of you who've been watching around the world. Once again, in the past 24 hours, more than 100,000 of you signed our petition to call for an alternative to UNRWA to support peace over terrorism, which I'm going to present to the Secretary General. Thank you to everyone who showed your support. Your support around the world is the wind in our sails. If you want to stay informed about next steps, go to unwatch.org, sign up on our website. You can put in your email to subscribe to our newsletter. Follow us on social media, on Twitter, UNWatch, or myself, Hillel Neuer. The same for Instagram, the same for Facebook. Show your support, follow us, spread the information. We want to make the Middle East a better place. You know, this began on October 6th. We were looking to the Abraham Accords, and that is still potential. So let's do everything to support peace and reconciliation, to fight the terrorists, and indeed, let's try to make this world a better place and to explore alternatives beyond UNRWA. Thank you to all of our participants, all of our speakers. Thank you to our incredible team who organized this event, including Eileen and Dan Smith and Lewis and everyone else who worked so hard to make this event a possibility. Thank you very much.